The morning sun slowly crept over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across Morningside Park. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of dew on the grass, and the peaceful sounds of birds chirping echoed throughout the park. The stillness of the moment was only interrupted by the occasional rustle of leaves swaying gently in the breeze. For a brief moment, the city seemed to hold its breath, as though savoring the calm before the day's rush. At the heart of this serenity sat Samuel Carter, a man in his 70s, his hair peppered with gray, and his weathered hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee. Samuel had been coming to this park every morning for decades. It was more than just a place to sit. It was where he reflected, where he found peace, and where he could escape the hustle of city life, even for a brief moment. This park had always been a constant in his life, ever since he had helped design it in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. For Samuel, Morningside Park was a symbol of resilience, of hard-won victories, and of a community that had grown stronger over time. He sat on his favorite bench near the fountain, his eyes crinkling with a smile as he took a slow sip of coffee. The warmth spread through his body, contrasting with the cool morning air. His cane rested beside him, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Samuel felt a deep connection to the park, not just because of his history with it, but because it had become a gathering place for the community. Children played, joggers passed by, and elderly residents like him found solace in the park's quiet embrace. As he unfolded his newspaper and set it across his lap, he took in the beauty around him. The trees, once young saplings when the park was first built, now stood tall and strong. The flowers that lined the paths were in full bloom, their colors vivid against the morning sky. Samuel's mind wandered, thinking of the work that had gone into creating this space, a space where people of all races, backgrounds, and walks of life could come together. It was a vision that had taken years to realize, but seeing the park thrive, seeing people of all colors playing side by side, brought him a quiet sense of pride. In the distance, a few joggers passed by, exchanging casual greetings. Samuel nodded politely to those he recognized, offering a warm, familiar smile. His presence had become as much a part of the park as the oak trees lining the pathways. Samuel had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, and he was well known not just for his role in designing the park, but for the work he had done over the years to bridge gaps in the community, advocating for equality, justice, and peace. A few benches away, a man sat under the shade of a flowering dogwood tree. He appeared to be just another early riser enjoying the park, but there was something different about him. He was still, his posture rigid as though he were observing more than simply relaxing. His presence, though unremarkable at first glance, carried an air of quiet intensity. Marcus Harris, a former resident of the neighborhood who had returned to the area after years away, sat in the park that morning with a purpose. He was here for more than just the morning air. He had seen the changes in the neighborhood, and he had come back to help guide the next generation through the struggles that still lingered in the community. But today, as he watched Samuel from afar, his attention was solely on the elderly man. Marcus knew the history of Morningside Park well. He had grown up playing here as a child, alongside his friends of all races, back when the park had been a battleground for civil rights. It was a symbol of unity, but it was also a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As he sat in the park, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories of his own encounters with the police, of his struggles growing up in a city that hadn't always embraced diversity. But what stood out most to him that morning was Samuel's quiet strength. Marcus had seen countless men and women fight for justice, but Samuel's calm, unwavering presence in the face of adversity was something different. It was a reminder of the slow but steady progress that had been made, and of how much further they still had to go. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps crunching against the gravel path. Marcus's gaze flicked towards the entrance of the park as a figure appeared on the horizon. It was a young man, dressed in the crisp uniform of a police officer, his badge glinting in the sunlight. Officer James Walker walked into the park with an air of authority, his eyes scanning the area. His posture was straight, confident, almost as if he were on a mission. Marcus recognized him immediately, a new addition to the local precinct. He had seen him patrol the area a few times in the past week, But today, something felt different. Walker's gaze landed on Samuel, and there was a shift. Walker's eyes narrowed as he observed Samuel sitting quietly on the bench. To someone unfamiliar with the park's history, Samuel might have looked like any other elderly man enjoying his morning. But to Walker, there was something about him that didn't sit right. He had never seen the man before, and something about Samuel's calm, dignified demeanor made him suspicious. The young officer's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, a silent gesture that only added to the growing tension between them. Marcus watched intently, his body tensing as he noted the subtle shift in Walker's body language. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before, too many times. The officer was about to approach Samuel, and it would likely not end peacefully. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed a police officer act out of unwarranted suspicion in this park, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, something felt different. The tension was thicker, the stakes higher. Marcus could feel it in his bones. This moment was about to change everything. Officer Walker took a few more steps, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he moved closer to Samuel's bench. The calm, peaceful atmosphere of the park seemed to shift with each step he took. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed down, the air charged with an unspoken tension. Samuel, still unaware of the approaching officer, took another sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth that spread through him. The paper lay open on his lap, his fingers gently tracing the words as he read. Walker was now within a few feet of Samuel, his eyes trained on the elderly man. He came to a stop and stood there for a moment, taking in the image before him, a quiet, unassuming figure in the midst of a bustling park. Samuel's weathered face, the slight tremor in his hands, and the dignity in his posture made him appear as though he belonged, as though he were a part of the park itself. But to Walker, that feeling of belonging seemed foreign. He had been taught to view authority as an unquestionable right, and it was this mentality that brought him to the man sitting on the bench. "Excuse me, sir," Walker said, his voice sharp and authoritative, breaking the stillness. The words echoed in the otherwise quiet park, drawing the attention of a few nearby joggers and dog walkers. Samuel looked up from his newspaper, startled for a moment, but his expression quickly shifted to one of calm curiosity. "Good morning, officer," he replied in a steady voice, folding the newspaper carefully and setting it down beside him. There was no fear in his voice, just the quiet strength that had carried him through many similar encounters in the past. "I'm Officer Walker," the young officer continued, his tone not entirely unfriendly but laced with suspicion. "What are you doing here? You don't look like you belong in this park." Samuel's brow furrowed ever so slightly at the remark. He had been coming to this park every morning for years, long before Officer Walker had even thought of becoming a police officer. But he simply nodded and answered with patience. "I've been coming here for decades, officer. I live just a few blocks away. This is my usual spot to sit, read my paper, and enjoy a cup of coffee." Walker's eyes narrowed. He glanced around the park, taking in the peaceful scene, the children playing, the elderly couples strolling along the paths. The park was a public space after all, but there was something about Samuel's presence that unsettled him. Maybe it was the quiet defiance in the way Samuel sat, as though he had a right to be there, a right that he was unwilling to give up no matter what an officer might say. "This is a residential area," Walker continued, his voice more forceful. "You don't look like you're from around here. Can you prove that you live in this neighborhood?" Samuel's hand trembled as he placed his coffee cup back down, his steady gaze meeting Walker's. The officer's words stung with the implication, but Samuel wasn't about to let his dignity be questioned so easily. "I've lived here for over 40 years, officer. I'm not just a visitor. This is my community," Samuel replied, his voice unwavering. "I'm not loitering. I'm just enjoying a quiet moment. I've been coming here every morning for as long as I can remember." The young officer took a step closer, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Well, I haven't seen you around here before," Walker said, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you can't prove you live here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This park is for residents. I can't let people just hang around without reason." Samuel remained seated, his hand resting lightly on his cane. He took a slow breath, a deep, calming inhale. His heart had started to race, but he was determined to keep his composure. "Officer, I've been coming here for years. I'm not a troublemaker." There's no need for any of this. If you need proof of residency, I'll gladly speak with your supervisor, Samuel said, his voice still steady, but with a hint of frustration creeping in. Walker's face reddened, his impatience showing. I don't have time for this, old man, he sneered. I'm giving you a choice. Either you leave or I'll arrest you for trespassing. It's that simple. The words hit Samuel like a slap to the face. The threat was unnecessary, especially given the peaceful nature of the situation. His heart tightened, a familiar pang of anxiety gripping him. The stress was starting to take its toll. Samuel gripped his cane tighter, his knuckles turning white. But he refused to let Walker see any weakness. He had lived through too much to let a moment like this undo him. I'll move along when I'm ready, officer, Samuel said, his voice still calm but firm. There's no need for threats. Walker stepped forward again, this time with more force, as though trying to intimidate Samuel into compliance. He grabbed Samuel's arm, yanking him upright with a harsh motion. Enough talking, Walker growled. You're coming with me. The sudden movement caused Samuel to gasp in pain. His cane fell to the ground, clattering against the pavement. The sharp jolt of pain shot through his shoulder, a reminder of his age, of the wear and tear his body had endured over the years. But Samuel refused to give in. He had faced down bigger threats than this, and he wasn't about to back down now. Please, officer, Samuel wheezed, struggling to keep his balance. There's no need for this. I'm not resisting. I just need a moment. Please. His heart raced, each beat sending a wave of pressure through his chest. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stand without collapsing. Marcus Harris, who had been observing the scene from a distance, could feel the tension escalating. His body tensed, ready to intervene, but he held back for now. He had seen enough police encounters in his time to know how quickly these things could turn. Samuel was a man of dignity, but that didn't always protect you from the weight of an officer's authority. Just as Walker began to tighten his grip on Samuel's arm, a commanding voice rang out across the park. Stop! The moment Chief Raymond Mitchell's commanding voice cut through the air, the tension in Morningside Park seemed to freeze, as if the world had paused in anticipation. Samuel's heart, which had been racing with the shock of the confrontation, slowed for a moment. Officer Walker, still gripping Samuel's arm, froze, his hand trembling as he turned to face the figure approaching with authority. From the distance, Chief Raymond Mitchell strode toward them, his tall figure cutting through the park like a force of nature. Dressed in the standard uniform of a police officer, the lines of his face were sharp, but it was the intensity in his eyes that commanded attention. His salt and pepper hair hinted at years of service, but his gaze, fierce and controlled, was something Walker had seen in few other men, especially in the field of law enforcement. Let him go, Officer Walker. Chief Mitchell's voice was calm, yet there was an undeniable power in his words that made the young officer hesitate. Walker blinked, taken aback. The name Mitchell echoed in his mind for a split second, but it didn't register until Mitchell was standing before him. The realization hit like a hammer. This was Chief Raymond Mitchell, the man who had been a pillar in this community, whose reputation as a no-nonsense officer of the law was known citywide. Even someone like Walker, who had only been with the force for a few years, knew Mitchell's name. I didn't know he was... I thought he was... Walker stammered, his face flushing with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. He looked at Samuel, who was still standing, though clearly struggling under the strain of the situation. Samuel's expression remained steady, despite the pain and the stress. Doesn't matter what you thought, Walker, Chief Mitchell interjected, his voice unwavering. He took a few steps closer to Samuel, his presence like a shield against the young officer's actions. This is Samuel Carter. He's been part of this community for longer than you've been on the force. You don't have the right to treat him like a criminal just because you're unfamiliar with him. Walker looked down at the ground, the weight of the chief's words settling heavily on him. He wasn't used to being reprimanded in front of others, especially not by someone with the rank and experience of Mitchell. But there was something else too. Fear. Fear that he had made a mistake, a big one, and that the consequences of his actions might reach further than just this moment. Samuel, still standing tall with his cane in hand, exhaled deeply, letting the air settle in his chest. His hand remained on his cane, the grip tightening as he caught his breath. Despite the physical strain, his mind was already racing. He had faced down greater adversity in his life, but today's encounter with Walker had struck a raw nerve. It wasn't just the physical discomfort or the threat of arrest. It was the sheer indignity of it all. The assumption that a man of his age, his experience, could be reduced to nothing more than a suspect in a public park. "You all right, Mr. Carter?" Chief Mitchell asked gently, his voice now softening with concern as he stepped closer to Samuel. Samuel nodded, though his breath was still shallow. "I'm fine, Raymond," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Just a little winded." He paused, glancing toward Officer Walker, who was still standing awkwardly beside them. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened, though." Chief Mitchell's expression darkened slightly as he turned to look at Walker, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "I'll take it from here," Mitchell said, his gaze unwavering. "You can go back to patrolling the park, Walker." Walker nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. He quickly turned and walked away, his head low, leaving Mitchell and Samuel alone. The moment was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of what had just occurred and what might come next. Samuel, though still shaken by the confrontation, felt a small measure of relief. Chief Mitchell was someone he could trust. The weight of the situation had lifted, but only slightly. There was still work to be done, work to heal the wounds that incidents like this left behind. "Thank you, Raymond," Samuel said, finally letting out a long breath. "I've had enough of this today. Too many memories." Mitchell gave a small nod, his eyes softening with empathy. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Samuel. This is exactly what I've been trying to avoid." Samuel's eyes flickered toward the park, where the early morning joggers and dog walkers had resumed their routines. The moment of tension had passed, but the undercurrent of something far deeper remained. Racial profiling, suspicion, the assumption that someone didn't belong. It was all too familiar, too ingrained. Samuel had witnessed it his whole life, both in this park and beyond. He had fought against it during the civil rights movement, and now, decades later, he was still fighting the same fight. But things had changed, right? They had to. They had to be better now. Samuel had worked tirelessly to create a space where people could feel welcome, where there would be no division based on race or background. Oakwood Park, no, Morningside Park, was a testament to that struggle, to the victories they had achieved. "You know," Samuel began slowly, his voice tinged with reflection, "I've been coming to this park every day for over 40 years. Back when I helped design it, this place was a symbol of hope, a place where people could finally come together, no matter who they were." Chief Mitchell nodded, his eyes focused on the older man. "I know, Samuel. This park means a lot to me, too. I was there, just like you, pushing for change." There was a pause, a moment of shared understanding between the two men. Mitchell had grown up in the neighborhood, and though their paths had diverged over the years, they both carried the same memories of struggle, of victory, and of the fight for justice. "I'm working on it, Samuel," Mitchell said, his tone sincere. "This isn't the kind of thing I want to see happen again. We're going to make sure the officers in this precinct understand the community better. This is our home. This is your home." Samuel gave a tired smile, though there was a certain sadness in his eyes. "I hope so, Raymond. I really do." The park once again fell into its natural rhythm as people resumed their routines, oblivious to the small storm that had passed through. Birds resumed their cheerful songs, joggers picked up their pace, and the scent of fresh-cut grass hung in the air. But for Samuel and Chief Mitchell, the calm was fleeting. Both men stood in the quiet aftermath, the weight of the incident still lingering. Samuel carefully lowered himself back onto his bench, his fingers briefly brushing the cool metal of his cane as he settled in. His body felt heavy, drained from the tension of the altercation. He sat for a moment, taking in the peaceful scene around him, before turning his gaze back to Mitchell. The chief stood, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the park that had witnessed so much of their lives, the good and the bad. "It's hard, isn't it?" Samuel's voice broke the silence. "You think you've made progress, that things are better, but moments like this, moments like today, remind you just how far we still have to go." Chief Mitchell exhaled slowly, the frustration evident in the lines of his face. "I know, Samuel. I feel it too. Every time we think we've moved forward, something like this happens and it sets us back. And it's not just one officer, it's a culture, one that takes time to change. Samuel nodded, looking out at the park. It's not easy to change a system that's been in place for so long. It's ingrained in people's minds, in the way they operate, in how they view the world and the people in it. Mitchell's expression softened, his eyes betraying a hint of guilt. That's why I'm here. I'm trying to make sure this doesn't happen again, but it's not enough to just talk about it. We need action. Real action. Samuel watched as Mitchell's words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking in. I know you're doing your best, Raymond, but you're right. It's not enough. You need to teach them. Show them the history, the pain, the perspective. Most of them, especially the young ones, don't understand the struggles we've been through. You're right, Mitchell agreed, his voice low with determination. That's why I want you to help. I need your voice. The community needs your voice. He paused, looking down at Samuel. I want you to speak to the officers. Share your story, your experience. They need to hear it, not just from me, but from someone who's lived through it. Samuel's gaze shifted, his brow furrowing slightly. I've seen enough in my time, Raymond. I've spoken to more officers than I care to remember. Some listen, some don't. But I'll do it. If you think it'll make a difference, I'll help. I don't have the energy to fight the same battles over and over again, but maybe my story will plant a seed that'll grow. Mitchell's eyes brightened with a flicker of hope. It's more than just your story, Samuel. It's about showing them that change is possible, that we can work together, that the police can protect rather than intimidate. You've lived through the worst of it. You've seen the injustices, and now we have an opportunity to make sure future generations don't have to. Samuel leaned back in his seat, his hand gently tapping his cane. The years seemed to weigh on him in that moment. Years of struggle, years of watching the same injustices unfold time and time again. But there was something in Mitchell's words, something in his eyes that stirred a flicker of hope in Samuel's chest. Maybe it was the promise of real change, or maybe it was the chance to speak to a new generation, one that might be able to finish the work that had been started long ago. I'll do it, Samuel said finally, his voice firm, though tinged with exhaustion. But I'll need to bring some of the younger ones with me. People like Shanice, Marcus, Jamal, they're the ones who'll carry this fight forward. Mitchell nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I agree. They need to be part of this. It's their future we're talking about. We can't change anything without them. As they spoke, the sun began its climb higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The morning rush had passed, and the park was slowly filling up with more people. Families, children, and older couples, finding their own moments of peace in the same space that had just witnessed a confrontation. The world moved on, unaware of the deep conversations taking place in the quiet corners of the park. But for Samuel and Mitchell, this conversation felt like a turning point. Samuel had seen countless moments like this in his life, but for the first time in a long while, he could see the potential for something to actually change. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community, about the future. As the minutes passed, Samuel stood up, his hand gripping his cane for support. He stretched out his legs, feeling the tightness in his muscles, but his posture remained strong. Let's get started then. The sooner we start talking, the sooner we can make sure this doesn't happen again. Mitchell smiled, his respect for Samuel evident. I'll get the ball rolling, Samuel. You're not alone in this. I'll make sure the officers understand what's at stake. The following day, Samuel found himself sitting in the small conference room of the police precinct, a stark contrast to the calmness of Morningside Park. The space was sterile, its walls adorned with portraits of past chiefs, and the harsh fluorescent lighting made everything feel too bright, too clinical. Chief Mitchell had arranged the meeting with the precinct's officers, and Samuel had agreed, though he wasn't sure what to expect. He was no stranger to speaking up, but this felt different. This wasn't a civil rights rally or a community meeting. It was a room full of police officers, the very people who had often treated him like an outsider, a threat, a suspect. Samuel sat at the table, his hands resting on the cane beside him. His eyes were fixed on the group of officers gathered in front of him. their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and perhaps a touch of defensiveness. Some of them avoided his gaze entirely, while others looked at him with an almost detached interest, as though he were an exhibit in a museum rather than a living, breathing person with decades of experience. Mitchell stood at the front, his presence commanding, but even he seemed aware of the weight of the moment. He had briefed the officers before, explaining the importance of the meeting, but Samuel knew that what was about to happen would be far more powerful than anything Mitchell could say. It would be his story, his truth, that would hopefully reach them. "I'm glad you could all make it today," Chief Mitchell began, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "As many of you know, Samuel Carter is a pillar of our community. He's seen the best and the worst of this neighborhood, and he's here to share his story, a story about his experiences with law enforcement, both past and present. I urge you all to listen with an open mind and understand that the conversations we have today can help us improve, both as officers and as members of this community." There was a murmur of acknowledgement, but Samuel could feel the tension still lingering in the air. The room was quiet, expectant, almost too quiet. His heart began to race again, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He had been fighting for justice his whole life, but this felt different. He wasn't just sharing his experiences with a group of activists or community leaders. He was speaking to the very people who held the power to change the course of things, for better or worse. With a deep breath, Samuel stood. His knees ached as he rose, but his back was straight, and he felt a sense of purpose that pushed the physical discomfort aside. He adjusted his shirt and cleared his throat before speaking, his voice calm but firm, steady but filled with the weight of experience. "I've been coming to this park for over 40 years, he began, his gaze sweeping over the officers. "And for most of that time, it's been a place of peace for me. A place where I could sit, drink my coffee, and feel like I belonged. But that wasn't always the case. When this park was first created, it wasn't just a park. It was a battleground, a symbol of progress. It was the 1960s, and we were fighting for our rights, for a place to exist without fear of being judged simply by the color of our skin. I was there when this park was built. I helped design it, not just as a park, but as a space for unity." Samuel paused, letting his words sink in. He could see some of the younger officers shifting in their seats, their expressions guarded, perhaps not fully understanding the history he was talking about. He continued, his voice gaining strength with each sentence. "I've seen a lot in my time. I've been harassed by officers who assumed I didn't belong. I've been followed, questioned, and treated like a criminal just because I was walking in my own neighborhood. And I've watched that same treatment happen to countless others. Young men, families, people who look just like me. We're often seen as suspects, not citizens. And I'm sure many of you here today don't see it that way. But the truth is, I've lived it. And it's hard to forget that. It's hard to forget how many times I've been made to feel like I don't belong." Samuel's gaze landed on a few of the officers who were looking at him intently now, some faces softening as they began to understand the gravity of his words. He could feel their skepticism starting to fade, replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or a recognition of the deep pain that had been carried in this community for so long. "I know things have changed. I know that not all of you are here to harass people or make them feel less than," Samuel continued, his tone softer now. "But that doesn't mean the work is finished. There are still people out there who feel like they don't belong, and there are still officers who see them as threats rather than neighbors. That's what I want you to understand today. That's what we need to fix." He took a slow, steadying breath, his hand resting on his cane again as he shifted his weight slightly. "I'm here to talk to you because you hold the power. You have the ability to change things, to make this community a place where everyone can walk with their head held high, a place where we can come together, not as us and them, but as equals, as people who are all trying to live a good life. And I'm asking you to do better. I'm asking you to understand that your role isn't just to enforce the law, it's to protect and serve, to make sure that everyone in this community feels safe, seen, and valued." The room was silent now. Every officer sat in stillness, their eyes locked on Samuel as he spoke. There was no scoffing, no dismissive glances, Just a room full of people listening, perhaps for the first time, to the voice of someone who had lived through the very system they were a part of. Samuel took one last look around the room before sitting back down, his heart still racing, but his spirit oddly calm. He had said what he needed to say. Now it was up to them. It was up to the officers in that room to decide what kind of change they were willing to fight for. Chapter 3. The Confrontation Begins. Part 2. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Samuel sat back, his hands resting on his cane, waiting for the response that he knew had to come. There was no immediate outcry, no defense or argument, just an uncomfortable quiet that seemed to settle over everyone present. Chief Mitchell stood still at the front of the room, his gaze flickering between Samuel and the officers, waiting for them to process what had just been said. This was a pivotal moment, one that could shape the future of policing in their community. Finally, one of the officers, a younger man with light brown hair and an unreadable expression, shifted in his seat. His name tag read, Officer Daniel Green. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice hesitant but serious. I never really thought about it like that, Green said, his tone carefully measured. I guess I've never been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. But listening to you, Mr. Carter, I can understand how it feels. I can't say I know what it's like, but I can hear you, and it's hard to ignore. Samuel gave him a small nod, acknowledging the officer's willingness to listen. It was a start, a crack in the wall of indifference that had often surrounded the relationship between police and the community. The officer's admission wasn't the solution, but it was a sign that perhaps the conversation could go somewhere productive. Another officer, Officer Lacey, who had been sitting quietly with her arms crossed, finally spoke up. She had been a patrol officer for several years and had witnessed her fair share of tension between the force and the community. But today, there was a change in her demeanor, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. I've seen what you mean, Samuel, Officer Lacey said, her voice soft yet firm. I've been in situations where people feel targeted, where it feels like we're not seeing the person, just their skin or where they live. I've been part of those interactions, and honestly, I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to make anyone feel like they're not welcome or that they don't matter. The sincerity in Officer Lacey's voice was palpable, and for the first time that day, Samuel saw a flicker of hope. It wasn't just about acknowledging the problem, it was about wanting to be part of the solution. The willingness to change, to confront one's own biases, was what had been missing for so long in so many departments. If more officers like Lacey could recognize that, maybe, just maybe, things could start to shift. Chief Mitchell watched the exchange carefully, his gaze lingering on the officers who were starting to open up. He knew this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But he also knew that the process of change had to start somewhere, and today it had started with Samuel. We can't just sweep this under the rug, Chief Mitchell said, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. We've got to do better. We've got to actively work to build trust, to understand our community. And that starts with each and every one of us. It's not enough to just show up to work and do our jobs. We have to do them with compassion, with a recognition of the humanity in everyone we interact with. Mitchell turned his gaze toward the officers in the room, letting his words settle. He could see some of them absorbing the weight of his statement, while others still seemed resistant, holding on to old habits or beliefs. But today there was at least a crack in the armor. They had listened to Samuel. They had heard his story, and that was more than many had done before. Samuel glanced around the room, taking in the officers' faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but none were dismissive. He could feel the shift, however subtle, and he allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. This wasn't going to be an overnight fix, but it was a step forward, a big step. I know this isn't going to change overnight, Samuel said, his voice steady. And I know there are officers out there who still don't understand or don't care, but it's a start. If we keep talking, keep pushing for change, we might just get there. It's not about any one person. It's about the community as a whole. If we work together, if we see each other, We can make this place better for everyone. The room was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of tension or fear, but the kind of quiet that came with the realization that something important had just been said, something that could change their perspective, if they were willing to let it. Chief Mitchell nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Samuel's. Thank you for sharing that, Samuel, and thank you to everyone here for listening. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but today is a beginning. As the meeting began to wind down, Samuel felt a strange sense of both exhaustion and hope. The words had been said, the conversation had started, but it wasn't over. This was just the first of many difficult, uncomfortable conversations. But as he looked around the room, he saw something he hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity, some discomfort, but most of all, the beginning of change. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. This concludes the second part of Chapter 3, where the officers begin to respond to Samuel's story, and there is a shift in the dynamics within the room. The foundation for real change is laid, but the path ahead is still uncertain. Let me know if you would like to continue with Chapter 4 or need any adjustments. The day after the meeting at the precinct, Samuel returned to Morningside Park. The air was crisp, the sunlight softer than before, as though the park itself was still processing the conversation that had unfolded within the walls of the precinct. There was a slight breeze rustling through the trees, and the park felt quieter than usual. Samuel sat at his usual bench, his cane resting beside him. He took a deep breath, letting the peace of the park settle over him. But beneath it, a sense of unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the work wasn't finished, that today's progress was only a small part of something much bigger. He had spoken to the officers, shared his truth, and for the first time in years, he had felt heard. But words alone weren't enough. Action, real, lasting action, was what was needed. Samuel was keenly aware of the task ahead, one that wasn't about him alone, but about the future of the entire community. As he settled into the bench, his thoughts drifted back to the past, back to the struggles, the marches, the sit-ins. He had fought for change once, and now it seemed as though he would have to fight again, though the battle had shifted. This time it was less about physical confrontation and more about changing hearts and minds, a shift that was even more difficult, more insidious. Samuel's fingers tightened around his cane, feeling the familiar grooves worn into the wood. It wasn't just a tool for walking, it was a symbol of his endurance, his ability to stand firm even when things seemed impossible. Across the park, a figure caught his attention. It was a man sitting on a bench a few yards away, partially hidden by the shadow of a nearby tree. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. He had been coming to the park every day for years, and he knew most of the faces around here. But this man was different. He wasn't a regular. Samuel studied him for a moment, trying to place him, but the man remained still, his posture upright and focused, though he wasn't looking directly at Samuel. There was something about his presence that seemed deliberate. Samuel's instincts kicked in. He knew what it was like to be watched, to feel the weight of someone's gaze on you, even when they weren't overtly looking. The tension in the air seemed to shift, and Samuel couldn't help but feel that the man's attention wasn't random. This wasn't the usual passerby, or even the joggers who nodded at him as they went by. No, this man was observing him, and something in his manner suggested that he wasn't just there to enjoy the park. As Samuel took a slow sip of his coffee, he noticed the man's eyes flicker for just a moment, as though catching the briefest glance in his direction. Samuel turned his attention back to the scene before him. Children playing on the swings, a couple walking their dog, a few elderly residents taking their usual morning stroll. Life continued around him, unaffected by the subtle tension that had begun to hang in the air. The man remained in his seat, his gaze now fixed on Samuel, though he had made no attempt to approach. Samuel wasn't sure why, but he had a sense that something was off. His instincts told him to stay alert, to be aware of the subtle movements of those around him. He had lived through enough in his time to know when things were about to change, when the calm before the storm was only an illusion. It was then that the sound of footsteps caught Samuel's attention. At first, it was just a faint sound, barely noticeable over the usual morning noise of the park. But then the steps grew louder, more deliberate. Samuel's gaze shifted, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw Officer Walker approaching. The young officer was walking towards him, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Samuel's hand instinctively tightened around his cane. The memories of yesterday's confrontation with Walker resurfaced, and the tension in his chest flared again. Walker's eyes met Samuel's, and for a moment, neither man moved. Samuel wasn't sure what Walker's intentions were, but after the way things had escalated the day before, he knew better than to take anything for granted. He couldn't just pretend that everything had returned to normal. Not yet. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Officer Walker said, his voice polite, but there was an edge to it that Samuel didn't miss. It was the same tone he had used the day before, sharp, almost rehearsed. Samuel studied Walker carefully, searching for any sign of sincerity, but found none. "Good morning, officer," Samuel replied evenly, his voice calm despite the unease in his gut. "What brings you here today?" Walker hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the side as though weighing his words. "I just wanted to check on you, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone softening slightly. "After everything that happened yesterday, I thought I'd make sure you're okay." Samuel's eyes narrowed. The words didn't sit right with him. It was too little, too late. Yesterday, Walker had acted with hostility, had threatened him with arrest. Now he was here, standing before him, pretending to show concern. Samuel leaned slightly forward, his hand resting on the cane. "I'm fine, officer," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of suspicion. "But I'll tell you this, I don't need anyone to check on me. Not unless they're truly ready to listen. Yesterday was a mistake, and I don't think you even understand the gravity of it yet." Walker flinched at the words, his face betraying a flicker of discomfort. He glanced over his shoulder, as though unsure whether he should continue. The man on the bench, who had been observing from a distance, stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate, calculated. He wasn't rushing toward them, but he was approaching with purpose. Samuel couldn't help but watch the man as he drew closer, his attention now fully divided between Walker and this new figure. The man who had been observing from the bench moved toward them with steady steps. Samuel's gaze shifted between him and Officer Walker, his senses heightened, the air thick with unspoken tension. The newcomer was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed casually but with an air of authority about him. Nothing overt, but it was there in the way he carried himself. His presence felt like a shift in the atmosphere, a shift Samuel couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore either. Walker's eyes followed the man as he approached, his brow furrowing in confusion. Samuel, however, couldn't take his eyes off him. There was something about the man's demeanor that felt different from the usual park-goers. It wasn't just that he had been watching. There was an intensity in his gaze, a sharp focus that Samuel recognized all too well. This wasn't someone simply enjoying the morning in the park. This was someone who had been waiting for the right moment, observing, calculating. As the man drew closer, Samuel could see the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes. He was certainly familiar with him, or at least with the kind of presence he exuded. It wasn't until the man was within a few feet that the air around them seemed to shift once more. "Everything okay here, officer?" The man's voice was deep, resonant, and his words were not so much a question as a command. Walker stiffened, clearly taken aback by the sudden interruption. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied, his voice less certain than before. "I'm just checking on Mr. Carter, making sure he's all right after yesterday's incident." The man's eyes flicked over to Samuel, who now stood, his cane in hand, the tension palpable between the two. Samuel's eyes widened just slightly as the recognition clicked into place. The man standing before them wasn't just a bystander. He was Raymond Mitchell, Chief of Police. His presence was like a beacon, one that immediately commanded respect. Yet there was something unspoken in his arrival, an underlying reason why he had chosen this moment to intervene. "Raymond Mitchell," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the surprise that rippled through him. "I didn't expect to see you here today." Chief Mitchell gave him a slight nod, his expression calm but purposeful. "I tend to check in on my officers, Mr. Carter, especially after an incident like yesterday." His eyes flicked toward Walker, then back to Samuel. But more importantly, I think it's time we had a conversation, don't you? Samuel watched as Walker shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing as the full weight of the chief's presence sank in. Walker hadn't expected Mitchell to show up, much less intervene in this small exchange. But the chief wasn't here just as a figurehead of the department. He was here to make sure this situation didn't escalate further, to make sure that justice, or at least the beginning of understanding, was served. Mr. Carter, Chief Mitchell continued, his gaze now fully on Samuel. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the history, the distrust, the burden you've carried, and the work that needs to be done. I'm here because I need to make sure we're moving forward, and that includes making sure you're heard, whether it's in a meeting or here in the park. The shift in the conversation was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The moment felt heavy, charged with the weight of the conversation that had started the day before, one about accountability, understanding, and the future of the community. Samuel didn't just want an apology from Walker. He wanted action, change, something tangible that showed he wasn't alone in this fight. And here, standing before him, was Chief Mitchell, willing to listen. I'm glad you're here, Raymond, Samuel replied, his voice full of resolve. But there's a lot of work to do. There's more than just one officer who needs to understand. It's the system. It's the way things are done. It's how people like me are treated, how we're seen, and it's bigger than you or me or any one of us here. Mitchell nodded, his expression reflecting both empathy and understanding. I know it's bigger than just one conversation, but every step forward counts, Samuel. And I'm committed to making sure that the officers in my department understand the weight of their actions, the responsibility they have to protect and serve. The words were exactly what Samuel needed to hear. But he knew that words were only the beginning. He had seen enough false promises in his lifetime to be wary of just talk. What mattered now was how Mitchell followed through, and how much he was willing to challenge the system, not just the individuals. At that moment, Samuel turned his attention back to Walker, who still stood there, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Walker had clearly been thrown off balance by the sudden appearance of Mitchell, and he now seemed almost unsure of how to proceed. Officer Walker, Samuel said, his voice now calm, but with a sharpness that cut through the tension. Yesterday you made a choice, and it wasn't just about you and me. It was about the choices you make every day, about how you see people, about how you treat them. That matters. It matters in ways you may not even fully understand yet. Walker looked at Samuel, his gaze flickering with guilt, but also with a growing sense of realization. He had been quick to judge Samuel, quick to escalate a situation without considering the bigger picture. But now, standing here in front of the chief, Samuel's words seemed to weigh on him in a way they hadn't before. I didn't mean for it to go that far, Walker muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel let out a slow, controlled breath. I know you didn't, but that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't mean for it to happen, and yet it did. We all have a responsibility to recognize what's happening around us, to see the impact of our actions, to understand how much power we hold, especially in moments like that. There was silence for a moment, and Samuel saw the shift in Walker's expression. It wasn't one of defiance or defensiveness, but something softer, a recognition that he had been wrong. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. Mitchell, observing the exchange between Samuel and Walker, stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Walker's shoulder. It's okay, Officer Walker, but you need to do better. You need to see people for who they are, not just the uniform or the neighborhood they're in. You've heard Mr. Carter. Now let's make sure you understand. The young officer nodded, but his eyes were cast down, clearly processing everything that had just transpired. Samuel, though still cautious, allowed himself a small breath of relief. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and though the road ahead was long, at least now, there were more people willing to walk it with him. The morning after the exchange between Samuel, Officer Walker, and Chief Mitchell, Morningside Park seemed to carry a different energy. The usual calm was still there, but something had shifted beneath the surface, a subtle change in the air, as though the park itself was aware of the quiet revolution that had begun. Samuel had come to the park every day for decades, but today felt different. It wasn't just the familiar rhythm of joggers or the sounds of children playing. It was something deeper, a feeling that the place where he had fought for change many years ago was now becoming something more. Samuel sat at his usual bench again, watching the world move around him. His heart still raced, not from fear or anxiety, but from the realization that he had taken the first step in a battle that had never really ended. He had stood his ground, but this time, it wasn't just about his own rights. It was about the rights of everyone who had ever been treated as though they didn't belong, simply because of the color of their skin, or their age, or their place in the community. He sipped his coffee slowly, his gaze drifting over the park. The same families walked by, the same dogs barked as they were led along the paths, and the same children ran toward the playground, their laughter ringing through the air. But now Samuel saw it all differently. The smiles and the laughter weren't just a fleeting joy. They were reminders of how far they had come and how much farther they had to go. For a brief moment, Samuel thought back to his younger days, to the years when he had marched, protested, and fought for civil rights. It felt like another lifetime, but the memories were sharp, vivid images of the people he had met, the struggles they had faced, and the triumphs they had achieved. In those days, they had fought for equality, for the right to sit at a lunch counter, to go to school without fear, to live in neighborhoods without being told they didn't belong. Those battles had shaped him, but they hadn't ended. Not yet. Just as he was about to take another sip of coffee, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Carter, good morning." Samuel looked up, surprised to see Officer Lacey approaching him. She was walking slowly, her expression uncertain, but there was something in her eyes. A curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the weight of what had transpired the day before. Samuel had been prepared for more of the same from officers like Walker. Defensiveness, resistance. But Officer Lacey had been different. Her words from yesterday had stuck with him, a recognition that she had been part of the problem, but was willing to do better. "Good morning, Officer Lacey," Samuel said, his tone polite but reserved. "What brings you here today?" Lacey hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the bench beside him. She didn't seem to mind the slight discomfort of sharing a seat with someone she had once seen as a figure of suspicion, someone she had been trained to watch. But today, there was no barrier between them. It was just two people, both members of the same community, trying to figure out how to make things better. "I wanted to talk to you, Mr. Carter," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "After everything that happened yesterday, I've been thinking. A lot. And I wanted to say thank you for speaking up." Samuel raised an eyebrow, not entirely sure where this conversation was going. "Thank me?" he asked, his tone slightly more guarded. "You're welcome, of course, but I'm not sure I understand." Lacey looked down at her hands for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. "Yesterday, you helped me see something I hadn't really understood. Not just about the community, but about myself. About how easy it is to slip into thinking we're doing the right thing, when we're really just perpetuating the same mistakes. I've always tried to do my job well, to help people, but I've also been blind to how my actions, even without meaning to, could hurt others." Samuel listened carefully. Her words weren't just an apology, but an admission, one that carried weight. "It's good that you're seeing it, Officer Lacey," he said softly. "It's easy to fall into patterns, to think that things are fine because you're doing your job. But when you're the one with the power, you have to ask yourself what that power is being used for. Are you protecting and serving, or are you part of a system that keeps people down without even realizing it?" Lacey nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her. "I've been thinking about that a lot since yesterday, and I know I can do better. I want to do better, but I need to learn. I need to unlearn some things and relearn how to be the kind of officer this community deserves." Samuel studied her for a moment. There was sincerity in her voice, and her body language wasn't defensive or closed off. She wasn't here to justify her actions, nor was she looking for forgiveness. She was here because she wanted to make a change. It was a rare thing, and Samuel appreciated it. But he also knew that just wanting to change wasn't enough. "You're on the right track," Samuel said, "but it's not just about wanting to do better. It's about actively making sure that you're not just going through the motions. It's about recognizing your role in this system and being willing to challenge it, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. There was a long pause as Lacey absorbed his words. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "I'll do that," she said, her voice steady, "and I'll make sure I'm not just the kind of officer who's a part of the problem. I'll be a part of the solution." Samuel nodded slowly, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "That's all we can ask for. We can't change everything overnight, but every step we take counts. Every conversation, every person who chooses to see things differently, it all adds up." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. But there was a sense of hope, too. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a start. The beginning of a shift, a change that would take time, but which was already taking root. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the quiet conversation between Samuel and Officer Lacey continued to unfold. There was something about the park that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the ripple of change to spread. People passed by, lost in their routines, but Samuel and Officer Lacey were locked in a moment of shared understanding, the kind of rare connection that didn't happen every day. Lacey took a deep breath, her gaze focused ahead, not meeting Samuel's eyes for a moment. "I know I can't just go back to my usual routine after this. I need to speak up, take more initiative, make sure my colleagues understand that we have a responsibility to the people we're serving, not just as officers, but as human beings." Samuel nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on his cane as he considered her words. "That's the key, Officer Lacey. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone. When you walk into a room or when you stop someone on the street, you need to see them for who they are. People with stories, with lives, with experiences. They're not just suspects or perps. They're neighbors. They're members of your community." Lacey's eyes shifted to the park before them, the vibrant colors of the flowers and trees a sharp contrast to the heavier weight of their conversation. "I never really thought about it that way," she said quietly. "I've always been trained to look for the signs, to focus on the facts, to think about what could go wrong. But I've never stopped to think about how that affects the people I encounter, how it affects their lives." Samuel could hear the struggle in her voice, the internal conflict between what she had been taught and the reality she was beginning to understand. He could see the shift in her, a willingness to confront her own biases, her own assumptions, and to move beyond them. It wasn't an easy path, but it was one that could make all the difference. "It's a process," Samuel said. "We're all unlearning and relearning something every day. But you've taken the first step by acknowledging it, by being open to change. The rest will come with time, as long as you keep pushing for it." The words seemed to settle in the space between them, hanging in the air like a promise. Lacey looked over at Samuel, her expression softened. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Thank you for talking to me. I'm not sure where this road will take me, but I know I need to walk it differently." Samuel gave a slight smile, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of understanding and quiet pride. "You're welcome. And remember, the work is never done. You have to keep going, even when it gets tough. But if you keep your heart in the right place, you'll do well, and you'll help change things." Just as the conversation seemed to come to a natural conclusion, Samuel's attention was once again drawn to the figure sitting across the park. The mysterious man, the one who had been observing earlier, was now walking towards them. His pace was deliberate, and his eyes were fixed on them as he approached. Samuel could feel the weight of his gaze again, but this time, there was no uncertainty. "This man wasn't here, by chance. Looks like we're not the only ones who are paying attention today," Samuel muttered almost to himself. He turned his head slightly, watching as the man moved closer. Lacey, too, noticed the man's approach, and her posture stiffened, a sense of alertness returning to her. "Do you know him?" she asked, her voice low. Samuel shook his head. "Number. But I've got a feeling that we're about to find out." The man stopped in front of them, his presence imposing, yet not overtly threatening. He was tall, his features sharp, with an expression that was hard to read. There was something about him that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Samuel's instincts flared. This wasn't just some random park goer. It was someone with purpose. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice smooth and measured. "I've been looking for you." Lacey's hand instinctively moved toward her holster, but she didn't make a move. She watched carefully, unsure of the man's intentions. Samuel, on the other hand, met the man's gaze directly, sensing that whatever was about to unfold was going to take them all in a new direction. "You found me," Samuel said, his voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. "And you are?" The man paused for a moment, almost as though considering his words before answering. "My name is Marcus Harris," he said. "I've been watching what's been happening around here, and I believe it's time we talk." Samuel's brow furrowed as the name registered in his mind. "Marcus Harris?" he echoed. "You've been around here before?" Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I grew up in this neighborhood, and I've seen the changes. Some good, some bad. But there's still a lot of work to do. I've been involved in community activism for years, and now it's time to step in and help bring about real change." The revelation hit Samuel like a wave. He had heard of Marcus Harris. He was a name that carried weight in the community. He had been part of the grassroots efforts to address systemic inequality, to fight for resources in underprivileged neighborhoods. But this was the first time Samuel had actually met him in person. "And what exactly do you want with me?" Samuel asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. Marcus stepped closer, his tone serious. "I believe you've started something here, Mr. Carter, and I think I can help amplify it. We need more people who are willing to have these hard conversations, to challenge the systems in place that perpetuate inequality. I've seen the work you've done, and I believe we can push further. Together." Samuel studied Marcus, weighing his words. He knew that partnerships like this weren't to be taken lightly. The stakes were too high. But Marcus seemed genuine, and his presence here today was no coincidence. This was a man who had been involved in the fight for justice long before Samuel had ever stepped into the park that morning. "I'm listening," Samuel said finally, his voice steady. "But understand this. This isn't a game. It's a long road. And we're not done yet." Marcus's expression softened, his eyes reflecting the same resolve that Samuel had seen in the mirror countless times in his own life. "I know, but I'm ready for that road." The following week, the atmosphere around Morningside Park had changed subtly. It was as though a quiet undercurrent of hope had begun to flow through the community, a sense that things might finally be shifting, that change, although slow, was inching its way forward. Samuel could feel it in the way people greeted him, in the conversations that took place in passing, and in the growing number of faces who came up to him with expressions of gratitude. It was as if they too had recognized the long road ahead and were finally beginning to believe that it might not be as impossible as they once thought. But Samuel knew better than to get too comfortable. Change was fragile, easily undone, and never as swift as it seemed at first. The steps that had been taken were important, but they were just that, steps. The journey ahead would require persistence, resilience, and a continued willingness to challenge the status quo. As Samuel sat on his usual bench that morning, his coffee in hand, he reflected on the conversations that had taken place over the past few days. The meeting with Officer Lacey had stayed with him, her sincere desire to learn, to understand, to be part of something bigger than just the job she had been trained to do. It was rare to find such authenticity, and Samuel knew it was a rare opportunity to foster real change. But there was also Marcus Harris, who had come to him with a shared vision for the future. A future that wasn't just about reforming the police force, but about reshaping the entire community, making it one that embraced equality, understanding, and collaboration. The day before, Marcus had laid out his ideas for a new initiative, one that would bring together community leaders, activists, and law enforcement to discuss real solutions. He called it Bridges to Change, a program designed to break down the barriers between the police and the people they served. It was ambitious, but Samuel could see its potential. This was exactly the kind of effort they needed to address the systemic issues that had been festering for so long. As he pondered the next steps for this new program, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Looking up, Samuel saw Chief Raymond Mitchell walking toward him, his long stride purposeful. His presence, as always, commanded attention, But today there was something different in his expression, a quiet intensity that spoke of things yet to come. Samuel had grown accustomed to Mitchell's visits to the park over the years, but today felt more significant. The chief's arrival was no coincidence. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Chief Mitchell greeted, his voice warm but carrying the weight of something more. "How's the morning treating you?" Samuel stood slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his joints, but his back remained straight. "Better now that you're here, Raymond. Have a seat." Mitchell nodded and took a seat beside Samuel, his eyes scanning the park before returning to meet Samuel's. There was a brief moment of silence as they both took in the sights. The joggers, the parents with strollers, the elderly residents enjoying the morning air. It was the same park that Samuel had fought to make a symbol of unity, a space where people from all walks of life could come together. But even now, after all the progress, there was still work to be done. "I've been hearing a lot of good things about the community lately," Mitchell began, his voice thoughtful. "People are starting to speak up, to come together in ways I haven't seen in years. And it's not just about the protests or the marches, it's the quiet work, the conversations happening in the background that are beginning to make a real impact." Samuel smiled slightly, his eyes scanning the park as well. "It's been a long time coming, but you're right. There's a shift. I can feel it. People are starting to believe again. They're starting to feel seen." Mitchell leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowed in thought. "And that's why I wanted to talk to you today, Samuel. There's something brewing here, and I don't want to let it slip through our fingers. We have an opportunity to make a real difference, not just in the community, but in how we're perceived as a police force. But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take action, real, tangible action." Samuel nodded, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "I've been thinking about that too. I've seen the changes. Small ones, but still important. But we can't afford to rest on our laurels, not when so much is at stake." Mitchell turned to him, his gaze direct. "I know that. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Samuel. And that's why I'm here. I've been working on something behind the scenes. I've been talking to city officials, getting their support. We're ready to take the next step. It's time to push for real policy change." Samuel's brow furrowed slightly. "Policy change? What are you talking about?" Mitchell took a deep breath, as though preparing to make a significant announcement. "I've been advocating for a complete overhaul of our training programs. We need to start with our officers, teach them about community engagement, racial sensitivity, de-escalation techniques. But it doesn't stop there. We need to involve the community directly. I want to bring in community leaders, activists, and even citizens who have had negative encounters with the police to help shape our new approach." Samuel was silent for a moment, processing the chief's words. This wasn't just another program or initiative. It was a complete rethinking of how the police interacted with the community. And for the first time, Samuel felt like the chief wasn't just paying lip service to the issue. He was genuinely committed to change. "That's a bold move, Raymond," Samuel said finally, his voice steady but filled with cautious optimism. "And it's long overdue. But it's not going to be easy. There will be pushback from both inside the department and from the community." Mitchell nodded, his expression unwavering. "I know, but I'm ready for that. We're not going to get it right all at once. But we have to start somewhere. And it starts now." The air between them was charged, the weight of Mitchell's words settling in with gravity. Samuel could feel the seriousness in the chief's tone, the urgency in his stance. This was more than just a conversation. It was a turning point. Samuel had long been a proponent of change, of challenging the system that had often kept communities of color oppressed and fearful of law enforcement. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of real hope that this wasn't just talk. This was a genuine attempt to create lasting change. "Raymond, this," Samuel began, his voice catching for a moment as he considered the enormity of what Mitchell was proposing. "This could work, but we need to get it right. We need to make sure the officers aren't just trained to de-escalate or to act with more empathy. We need to change the way they see the people they serve. They need to understand the history, the pain, and the weight of this community. Without that, it's just another training session, a box checked, Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. I agree. That's why I'm not just talking about training in isolation. I'm talking about a complete paradigm shift. We need to redefine what it means to be a police officer in this city. To serve, protect, and engage, yes, but also to listen, to learn, and to be a part of this community, not just standing apart from it. Samuel paused, absorbing the vision Mitchell had laid out. It wasn't just a change in training or policy, it was a shift in philosophy. A move toward a department that understood its role in society, not as a force to enforce laws, but as a bridge between people, a force for peace and equity. That's a powerful vision, Samuel said, his voice more resolute. But it's going to take a hell of a lot of work to make it stick. It's not just the officers who need to change. The community has to be involved too. If we're going to rebuild trust, it has to be a two-way street. The officers need to see us as partners, not just problems. And the community needs to feel like they can trust the people who are sworn to protect them. Mitchell nodded, his expression unwavering. Absolutely. That's why I'm inviting community leaders to be part of this process, to help shape the training. I don't want this to be top-down. It has to be collaborative. We need voices from every corner of this community, activists, business owners, youth leaders, and people who've had negative experiences with the police. They need to be heard. We need their input if we're going to make real change. Samuel's mind raced with the possibilities, but there was a nagging thought at the back of his mind. Change, no matter how well-intentioned, had never come easily. He had seen too many initiatives falter, too many reforms undone by lack of will or resistance from within. His heart wanted to believe in Mitchell's plan, but his experience told him to be cautious. You're right, Samuel said slowly. We need to bring in everyone. The more voices, the better. But Raymond, this is going to get messy. People will resist. People who've been in the department for years are going to fight this. They'll see it as a threat, as an attack on their authority. It's not going to be easy to get them on board. Mitchell let out a deep breath, as if he had already considered the potential obstacles. I know, but that's why we need to start now. We can't wait for everyone to be on board. If we wait for that, we'll be waiting forever. I'm ready to face the resistance head on. I know the department has its flaws, but we also have a lot of officers who want to do better. And they'll follow leadership. That's why I'm counting on you, Samuel. You've been through the fire. You know what it's like to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I need your voice. The community needs your voice. Samuel's gaze softened as he looked at Mitchell. He saw the sincerity in the chief's eyes, but more than that, he saw the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. Mitchell wasn't asking for Samuel's endorsement of an idea. He was asking for his help in making it a reality. It was a lot to take in, and Samuel knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a while, he felt a spark of something more than just exhaustion. He felt a flicker of hope, small but growing. I've spent my life fighting for justice, Raymond, Samuel said quietly, his voice tinged with the weight of his years. I've seen the good, and I've seen the bad. I've fought systems that were built to oppress, and I've seen the very people who are supposed to protect us turn their backs on the community. But I'll help. I'll be there to make sure this isn't just another failed attempt. We can't afford another failure, not now. Mitchell placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Samuel. I can't do this without you, and I know that together we can make a difference. The moment stretched on, the two men sitting side by side on the park bench, their conversation filled with the promise of change. Samuel knew there would be more difficult conversations ahead, more moments of resistance, more challenges. But for the first time, he felt like there was a genuine chance to create a police force that truly served its community, not just controlled it. Just as they were about to continue discussing the specifics of their plan, the sound of footsteps drew their attention. It was Marcus Harris walking briskly toward them, a determined look on his face. He had been busy spreading the word about the new initiative, meeting with other community leaders, and gathering support. His presence here now, just as the conversation was shifting toward the practical steps, was no coincidence. Gentlemen, Marcus greeted, his voice confident as always, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Mitchell stood, offering a handshake, his face brightening with the arrival of the man who had brought so much energy and vision to the fight. Not at all, Marcus. We were just discussing the next steps. We're about to take action. Marcus's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Well, you've got my full support, as always. Let's talk about how we move forward from here. The days following the conversation between Samuel, Chief Mitchell, and Marcus Harris were filled with quiet but purposeful work. The new initiative, Bridges to Change, was gaining traction. People in the community began to talk about it. Activists, business owners, educators, and even a few concerned citizens who had been skeptical at first. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just another empty promise. It was a serious effort to bridge the divide between the police and the communities they served. But while the community buzzed with discussions of change, Samuel knew that real transformation would take time and would require patience from everyone involved. It was a particularly cool afternoon when Samuel sat in the park again, his eyes tracing the familiar paths of Morningside Park, which had witnessed so much of his life. He had spent countless hours there, watching the seasons change, seeing children grow, and seeing the same cycle of struggles play out in the community. But today the air felt different, lighter somehow. There was a hope in the atmosphere, though Samuel understood the caution that came with such feelings. As he sat there, lost in thought, he noticed someone approaching, a familiar figure. Officer Lacey had become a regular visitor to the park over the past few days. She had reached out to Samuel several times since their conversation, eager to learn more and to take part in the changes they were trying to bring about. Today she walked toward him, her uniform slightly rumpled from a long day of patrol. But there was something different in her gait, something more relaxed, more confident than the first time they had spoken. Samuel stood up as she approached, offering her a nod. "Good to see you again, Officer Lacey." She smiled, but it was a quiet, thoughtful smile. "You can just call me Lacey," she said, sitting down beside him on the bench. There was no formality in her voice now, no guard up, no distance between them, just two people talking. Lacey looked around the park, her gaze lingering on the children playing in the distance, and then on the older residents sitting on other benches. "You know, when I first started working here, I never really paid attention to who was around. I just did my job, patrolled, answered calls, followed the script. I didn't stop to think about what the people in the park were going through, what they were feeling. But now, sitting here with you, I can't help but see it differently." Samuel leaned back, his hand resting on his cane. He studied her, noticing the subtle change in her demeanor. She wasn't just talking about her role as an officer, she was talking about herself. "It's good that you're seeing it differently," he said gently. "The hardest part is recognizing that things aren't as simple as they seem on the surface. People's lives, their struggles, their pain, they're not always visible, but they're real." Lacey nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think that's what's been bothering me the most. I've seen it. I've seen the looks people give me, the way they step aside or tense up when I walk by, and it's made me wonder, how many times have I contributed to that feeling? How many times have I made someone feel unsafe, just because of my uniform, just because of the badge?" The vulnerability in her voice caught Samuel's attention. He had seen many officers who were defensive, who brushed off questions about their role in community tension. But Lacey was different. She was asking herself the hard questions, and it was clear she wasn't afraid to face them. "That's the first step, Lacey," Samuel said quietly. "Acknowledging the problem. It's easy to ignore it, to tell yourself that you're just doing your job. But that's how the system keeps working, isn't it? It feeds off the assumption that things are fine when they're not. The real work starts when you're willing to face the discomfort of that truth." Lacey's gaze dropped to her hands, and for a moment there was silence between them. The sound of children's laughter and the distant hum of the city seemed to fade as they sat together, allowing the weight of their conversation to settle in. It wasn't just a dialogue about policing, it was about humanity, about the shared responsibility they had for each other, regardless of the uniforms they wore or the lives they led. "I've been talking to some of the other officers," Lacey continued, her voice low but filled with determination. "I've been telling them what we talked about, the need for real change. Some of them are on board, but others, they don't see it. They don't get it. They think we're fine as we are, that the system works. but I know better now. I've seen it from a new perspective, and I can't unsee it. Samuel nodded, his eyes steady as he listened. It's going to be tough, Lacey. You're going to face resistance, especially from those who've been in the department for a long time. But you have something they don't. You're seeing the cracks. You're seeing the humanity behind the badge. That's your strength. I hope so, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I'm going to need all the help I can get. As the park grew quieter and the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees, Samuel felt the weight of their conversation linger. Lacey was more than just a police officer. She was a person in the process of change, someone who was no longer content with the status quo. That was the kind of officer the community needed, someone who would listen, who would learn, and who would act not just out of duty, but out of empathy and understanding. Just as they were about to continue their conversation, the sound of footsteps approaching again interrupted them. This time it was Marcus Harris. He had been busy working with various community organizations and activists to build momentum for the Bridges to Change initiative, and he had arrived with a sense of urgency. "Good evening, you two," Marcus greeted, a smile on his face as he approached them. "I see we're all on the same page here, working towards something better." Lacey stood up, offering him a handshake. "It's good to see you, Marcus. We've been talking about the work ahead." Marcus's eyes shifted between Samuel and Lacey, sensing the tone of the conversation. He gave a small nod, his expression more serious now. "Well, I think it's time we take things to the next level. We've got to get the rest of the officers on board. If we're going to make real change, it's going to take all of us working together. Are you ready for that?" Samuel smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "I think we're ready, Marcus. Let's do this." The three of them stood for a moment, looking out over the park as the golden light of evening stretched across the green spaces. There was a stillness in the air, as though the city itself was waiting for something. Samuel, Marcus, and Lacey were at the center of that waiting, standing together at the crossroads of a future they all hoped to shape, one that would require effort, sacrifice, and, most of all, trust. "I think the next step is clear," Marcus said, breaking the silence. He looked at Lacey and Samuel, his tone resolute. "We need to start engaging directly with the community in a more structured way. We've been meeting with some activists, but now we need to bring in the officers who are already showing promise. We need their voices as much as the community's." Samuel nodded in agreement. "You're right. It's not enough for us to meet and discuss things behind closed doors. We need to create a forum for honest dialogue between the officers and the residents. The community has to feel like their voices are being heard, not just as an afterthought, but as an integral part of the process." Lacey shifted uncomfortably, her mind already racing with the logistics of the plan. "I think I can help with that, but we'll need a place, an environment where both sides can feel comfortable being open, without fear of judgment or retaliation. We can't have these discussions just for the sake of it. We need transparency." Samuel gave her a thoughtful glance. "And it needs to be consistent. One or two meetings won't change the dynamic we're fighting against. It's going to take repeated efforts, conversations that don't just stop when the room empties." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes sharp with focus. "Exactly. We need a strategy, a way to make this a continuous process, not just a one-time event. And we need to bring in the right people, community leaders who have credibility and can speak to the experience of the people. We need to make sure everyone who feels unheard gets a seat at the table." The idea of such an inclusive process was daunting, but also invigorating. Samuel could see the vision of it in his mind's eye. A room full of officers, community leaders, and residents all working together, not just talking past each other, but really listening. He could imagine the potential impact, the kind of change that could ripple through not just Morningside Park, but the entire city. "This is going to be a long haul," Samuel said, his voice steady, "but it's worth it. We've got to keep pushing forward." Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention once again. This time, it was Chief Mitchell, who had been kept informed of the progress of the initiative. His arrival marked another step forward. He was clearly here to discuss how to formalize their plans and integrate them into the city's broader police reform efforts. "Gentleman, Officer Lacey," Samuel, Mitchell greeted. his usual authoritative tone softened by the warmth in his voice. "I've been hearing good things. It looks like we're finally on the right track." "We've been talking about the next steps," Marcus said, his voice filled with purpose. "The community wants to be part of the solution, but they need to see us taking this seriously. They want us to put actions behind the words." Mitchell nodded, his face serious now. "And they'll see it, Marcus. I'm working on getting approval for the new training programs I mentioned to you last time. But it can't just be about officers. This has to be about the entire city. The police department can't be an island. We need to integrate better with community organizations, with the people we serve. This isn't just a police issue, it's a citywide issue." "Exactly," Samuel said, his voice steady. "And it's going to take time to break through the walls of mistrust. But if we keep working together, we'll get there." Lacey, who had been listening closely, spoke up. "We need to start creating spaces where officers can engage with the community in a non-enforcement capacity, where we're not just showing up to make arrests or respond to calls. We need to be present in the places people gather to show that we're not just here to police, but to serve." "That's exactly right," Mitchell affirmed. "It's all about visibility and accessibility. We need to find ways to connect with people in their own spaces, whether it's at community centers, local businesses, or even just in parks like this. It's about showing up, being there, not just when things are bad, but when things are good too." Samuel could feel the momentum building. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about making some cosmetic changes. This was about creating a new kind of relationship, one where officers were seen not as an occupying force, but as partners. It was about shifting the entire culture of law enforcement. "We've got to start small," Samuel said, his voice clear. "We need to build trust, bit by bit, and that means making sure that the first interactions people have with us are positive. People should know the officers they see on the street, not just in a uniform, but as people, as individuals who care about the community." Mitchell's gaze softened as he looked at Samuel. "I agree. And that's why, starting next week, I want to begin the first round of community engagement sessions. I want officers to go into neighborhoods and attend meetings, not as enforcers, but as listeners. We're going to start hearing directly from the people." The group stood for a moment in quiet reflection, considering the enormity of what lay ahead. There was still so much to do, so many barriers to break down, and so much resistance to face. But for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt a sense of hope rising inside him. It wasn't just that things might change, it was that they already were. The first community meeting to officially kick off the Bridges to Change initiative was set to take place in the heart of Morningside Park. The excitement in the air was palpable, yet there was also an undercurrent of uncertainty. The people who had fought so long for a better relationship with the police were now being asked to take a leap of faith, to believe that this time, something was going to change. Samuel sat quietly on a bench, watching the park slowly fill up with people. Families, elderly residents, young activists, and a few police officers, some familiar, some new, were beginning to gather. Samuel had seen his fair share of rallies, protests, and meetings. He had been to the marches during the civil rights movement, stood with others demanding change, and witnessed firsthand the resistance that came with pushing for justice. But today felt different. There was a new energy, a collective hope that had been missing for too long. The people who had been silenced by fear, by the weight of their experiences, were now ready to speak up. And this time, they were being listened to. Chief Raymond Mitchell arrived with a few officers from his department. They had agreed to participate in the meeting, though Samuel knew that for some, it wasn't easy. They were stepping out of their comfort zones, leaving the security of their uniforms and entering a space where they would be vulnerable, where they would have to listen, not just speak. As Mitchell approached Samuel's bench, the older man rose slowly, his cane tapping lightly on the ground. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," Mitchell greeted, his voice calm but filled with the weight of responsibility. "Afternoon, Raymond," Samuel replied, offering a nod as Mitchell took a seat beside him. The two men exchanged a brief knowing look. It had been a long road to get here, but they were both feeling the gravity of this moment. "Are we ready for this?" Samuel asked, his voice steady but tinged with the years of struggle he had endured. Mitchell nodded slowly. "Ready as we'll ever be. I've spoken to the officers. They're all committed. I've asked them to listen, to not just talk, but really hear what the community has to say. And I believe them. But the real challenge is in the room, with the people. We need to prove that we can change, that we're not here to just go through the motions. Samuel's eyes scanned the gathering crowd. There were skeptical faces among the crowd, as he had expected. People who had been hurt by the system, who had been mistreated or ignored for so long, were understandably hesitant. Samuel knew they had every right to be cautious. Trust wasn't something that could be granted easily, not after years of seeing the same patterns repeat themselves. Just then, Lacey approached, her steps purposeful but not hurried. She had been working closely with Chief Mitchell and the community organizers to make sure the event ran smoothly, and Samuel could see that she had a sense of responsibility she hadn't had before. "Everything's set," Lacey said, her voice firm but welcoming. "We've got everyone in place, and the speakers are ready. There's going to be a lot of sharing today, and I think that's the most important part. Listening, understanding, and hearing where people are coming from." "Good," Samuel replied, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the crowd. "This can't just be a one-time event. It needs to be the beginning of something bigger." Lacey nodded, glancing toward the park center. "I know. I'm just hoping that people are ready to talk. I've been trying to get officers to engage with the community more, not just when there's trouble. But I think this is where it starts, where the real dialogue can happen." Before Samuel could respond, the crowd grew quieter, and they all turned toward the makeshift stage at the heart of the park. Marcus Harris, the community activist who had worked alongside Samuel and Mitchell to bring the Bridges to Change initiative to life, stepped forward. The man had been a powerful force in the community for years, pushing for justice and equity in ways that resonated with both the younger and older generations. He was a charismatic speaker, able to speak both from the heart and from experience, and it was clear that the crowd respected him. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus said, his voice carrying through the park, firm but warm. "Thank you for coming today. This isn't just a meeting. It's a beginning of something we've all been waiting for. A space where we can come together, not as enemies, not as people separated by misunderstandings or fear, but as neighbors, as people who deserve respect and dignity. This is where we start the hard work, but I'm confident we can do it." His words were met with applause, some hesitant, others enthusiastic, but there was a palpable sense of solidarity in the air. Marcus stepped aside as Chief Mitchell took the stage, the crowd falling silent. The chief had always been known for his composure, his ability to command respect without being overbearing. But today he was facing something far more significant than a routine meeting or even a protest. Today he was facing the people who had long been the most critical of his department, and he knew that the words he spoke would matter more than ever before. "I'm here today," Mitchell began, his voice clear and steady, "to listen, to hear from you, the people we are here to protect and serve. I've heard your concerns. I know that we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust, but I'm not here just to talk about what we've done wrong. I'm here to listen to your ideas, your experiences, and your solutions. We're here to begin building bridges, not walls, and it's going to take every one of us working together." There was a moment of silence, and then a voice from the back of the crowd called out, "How do we know this time will be different?" The question hung in the air, sharp and direct. Samuel watched as Mitchell took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. He could feel the weight of the question on the chief, knowing that no answer would be enough unless it was backed up by action. Mitchell cleared his throat and addressed the crowd with a calmness that belied the tension in the air. "We know it won't be easy. We know there's no magic solution, no simple fix. But I promise you we're here because we want to make a difference. We're starting with listening, and we're going to keep listening. And together we will find the solutions that will make this community stronger." The response from the crowd was mixed. Some nodded in cautious approval, others crossed their arms or stood with their hands in their pockets, watching intently. A few murmured amongst themselves, still unsure whether this would lead to the tangible change they so desperately needed. Samuel could sense the skepticism in the air, but there was also something else, a feeling of cautious hope, as though the people gathered here had seen too many promises broken to fully trust that things could be different, but were still willing to entertain the possibility. One of the first speakers was Rachel Foster, an activist who had been a longtime advocate for police reform in the area. She had lived in the neighborhood for years, had seen the same cycle of tension between the police and the community, and had worked tirelessly to push for justice. Samuel had known her for a long time, and her presence at the meeting felt like a bridge between the frustration of the past and the hope of the future. Rachel stepped up to the makeshift stage, her eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Chief Mitchell. "I've been organizing protests. I've been at city council meetings. I've watched as promises were made and broken," she began, her voice clear and steady. "And I've been frustrated, just like everyone here. But today, I'm not here to judge. I'm here to ask for something real, for accountability, for change. But I'm also here because I want to see if this time, it's different." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, some applause, and a few skeptical looks. Rachel continued, "We're all here because we want a better future, a future where we're not afraid to walk our streets, where our children aren't stopped by officers just because of the color of their skin. It's going to take more than a few meetings and more than just a few new policies. We need a commitment to real change, from both sides, and that means no more empty promises." Rachel turned toward Chief Mitchell, her gaze steady. "So, Chief, we've heard the talk before. We've seen the reports. What we need to see now is action. We need to know that when you say we're working on change, you're not just talking, you're doing it. We need to see new training programs. We need to see better community policing, and we need to see transparency in how officers are held accountable." Chief Mitchell didn't flinch as Rachel's words landed. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her statement. "I hear you, Rachel. I understand the frustration, and I don't take it lightly. This isn't about just a few changes or a couple of new policies. It's about a new approach to law enforcement, one that prioritizes listening, understanding, and community first. But I also know that words alone aren't enough. We have to show you, through our actions, that we're serious." The crowd was still restless, but the tone was shifting. There was a tension between the desire to believe that change was possible and the reality of having been disappointed so many times before. Samuel had seen this before. He had seen people fight for what they thought was change only to have the system swallow their efforts. But today felt different. There was a determination in Mitchell's voice that hadn't been there before. As the meeting continued, other community members took turns speaking. Some shared their experiences with police brutality, some shared stories of positive interactions with officers, but most spoke about their desire for something better. People were ready to put the past behind them and work toward a future where they weren't afraid of the very people meant to protect them. But there was still tension. There were still those in the crowd who couldn't bring themselves to trust that this initiative would work. There were still old wounds, unresolved, lying just beneath the surface. Samuel knew this was only the beginning. They had taken the first step, but they needed to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, even when the path was uncertain. Then a voice from the back of the crowd rose up, cutting through the noise. "How do we know this isn't just more of the same?" It was a woman, her voice sharp and filled with skepticism. "How do we know you won't just go back to business as usual once this meeting ends? You talk about change, but we've seen this all before." The words stung, but Samuel understood them. They weren't just words, they were a cry of frustration, of years spent watching promises crumble. The woman wasn't wrong. They had all been here before. The system didn't change overnight. But Samuel also knew that this time, the community was more involved, more vocal. The officers in the room were here because they had been given the opportunity to listen and to act. Chief Mitchell took a deep breath, acknowledging the validity of the question. "I understand your skepticism," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But I ask for your patience and your participation. This is just the beginning. We can't change everything in one meeting or even in 1 month. But we're here to do the work, and we need your help to make sure that it's not just talk." The woman didn't say anything else, but her arms were crossed tightly, her stance one of resistance. Samuel could feel the weight of her question in the room. There were more like her in the crowd, people who had lost faith in the system, who had seen too many broken promises to believe this was going to be different. We're here because we have to be, Samuel said, stepping forward, his voice carrying across the park. We've fought too long for things to stay the same, but we also know that real change takes time. It takes us all. It's not just the police who need to change. It's the community too. We need to work together. It's not about who's right or who's wrong. It's about making sure that no one is left behind, that no one is treated as less than. We're here to listen, to learn, and to do better. But we can't do it without you. The crowd was quiet for a moment, the words hanging in the air. But then slowly the murmurs began again, this time with a different tone, less skepticism, more curiosity. The seed had been planted, and while it wasn't yet a full-fledged tree, it was beginning to take root. The day of the first official presentation to the police force had arrived, and the air in the precinct was thick with tension. Officers shuffled in and out of the briefing room, exchanging nervous glances as they prepared for what was undoubtedly going to be a difficult session. This wasn't going to be like their typical training. It wasn't about law enforcement techniques or new policies. Today was different. Today they would be asked to listen, to hear stories that many of them had never fully understood, perspectives they had never truly acknowledged. Samuel stood at the front of the room, his heart beating a little faster than usual. It wasn't fear that made his hands tremble slightly, but the weight of what was about to happen. He had spoken to crowds before, had been in front of the media during protests, but this was something else entirely. These weren't activists or community members. These were the officers he had fought against, the ones who had stood on the other side of the line for so many years. Today, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had been silenced by the badge, for those who had suffered because of systemic injustice. Chief Mitchell stood beside him, his presence solid, but even he couldn't hide the quiet sense of anticipation in the air. This was a moment of reckoning for everyone in that room. The officers had come to listen, but it was unclear whether they were ready to truly hear. The room slowly filled with officers, most of whom had already sat through countless training sessions, had attended debriefings about community engagement, racial profiling, and police reform. But this was different. Today, they would hear the stories of those whose lives had been shaped by their actions, people who had lived through the very thing they had been trained to uphold. "Thank you for being here today," Chief Mitchell said, his voice strong but carrying the weight of the moment. "This is not just another lecture. This is a conversation that we need to have if we are going to move forward, if we are going to build a police force that is truly part of this community. And that starts with listening, not just to the words, but to the experiences behind them." Samuel's gaze scanned the room, meeting the eyes of the officers seated before him. There were a few familiar faces, officers who had been at the meetings in the park, who had shown a genuine interest in the change they were trying to create. But there were also faces filled with skepticism, some who had been on the force long enough to be set in their ways, others who were simply here because they had been told to attend. Samuel knew that it wouldn't be easy to reach all of them, but today he wasn't just speaking for the community. He was speaking for those who couldn't be in the room, for those whose voices had been silenced for far too long. Lacey, who had become an unexpected ally, was sitting near the back of the room taking notes. She had been integral in helping organize the meeting, and it was clear that she was invested in the success of the initiative. But she, too, felt the tension. This wasn't just about listening. It was about changing how they saw the community, how they understood their role as officers, as protectors. "Today, we're going to hear from some of the community leaders," Chief Mitchell continued, breaking the silence. "We've invited individuals who have had negative encounters with law enforcement, as well as activists who have worked tirelessly to push for change. They're here not to accuse, but to share their stories and their perspectives." The doors to the room opened, and the first group of community leaders walked in. Among them was Rachel Foster, the activist who had spoken so passionately at the community meeting. She was accompanied by a few others, including Jamal, a young man who had been a victim of police profiling several years ago. Jamal was hesitant, his body language guarded, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. He had agreed to speak because he believed in what this initiative could achieve. But he wasn't naive. He knew that this conversation wouldn't be easy. Rachel stepped forward, her posture confident, though her eyes were filled with a quiet resolve. She was ready, but the weight of the moment settled over her as she took her place in front of the officers. She began speaking, her voice steady but with a palpable urgency behind it. "Thank you for allowing us to be here today," Rachel began, addressing the room. "I've been organizing for a long time, fighting for justice and equality. But I'm here today not just as an activist, but as a woman who has lived in this neighborhood for most of her life. I'm here to share my story, not just my fight for justice. I'm here because I want to help you understand what it feels like to live in fear of the very people who are supposed to protect you." The room was quiet as Rachel spoke. Some of the officers shifted in their seats, others crossed their arms, but all were paying attention. Samuel could feel the weight of her words land in the room, settling heavily in the hearts of those who were willing to listen. "I've been followed, stopped, questioned," Rachel continued, "and I know I'm not the only one. I've seen it happen to my neighbors, to my friends, to people I've never met, and it's not just one bad apple. It's systemic. It's part of the training, the culture, the idea that we are more likely to be criminals because of where we live or the color of our skin." Rachel paused, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't speaking to just one officer. She was speaking to all of them, calling them to recognize their role in a system that had allowed these injustices to continue for so long. "I'm not here to accuse you of being bad people," Rachel said, her voice softening slightly. "I'm here to ask you to see us as people, not suspects, to see that when we're stopped, it's not just an inconvenience, it's a threat. It's a reminder that no matter how much we try to do right, we are still seen as less than." The room remained silent as her words hung in the air. Samuel could feel the shift in the room, a subtle change, but one that was significant. Some officers shifted in their seats, their arms unfolding as they took in the truth of Rachel's words. It wasn't enough to change everything in an instant, but it was a start. As Rachel finished speaking, the room remained silent, the weight of her words settling deeply among the officers. It was clear that her honesty had cut through the defenses that many had instinctively raised. Samuel could see it in the officers' faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but none of them were dismissive. This, Samuel knew, was the moment they would look inward, questioning their roles in perpetuating the system that Rachel had just so powerfully described. Chief Mitchell stepped forward, breaking the silence. His presence was steady, calm, and perhaps even reassuring for the officers in the room. "I want to thank Rachel for her courage," Mitchell began, his voice unwavering. "I know this isn't easy, but these are the kinds of conversations we need to have if we are going to move forward. We can't make progress without hearing the hard truths." He turned to face the officers, his gaze strong but inviting. "We're not here to justify the system we've been part of. We're here to understand the pain that people like Rachel and many others have experienced, and we need to take responsibility for that, both as individuals and as a department. But understanding isn't enough. We need to act." The officers shifted in their seats, some nodding, others still processing the magnitude of what had just been shared. Samuel felt a stirring of hope, a sense that, for the first time in years, something real might be happening. But he also knew that change would take time, and that the real test would be how the officers would respond when the meetings were over and they returned to their daily duties. The next speaker was Jamal, the young man who had been stopped by police officers several years ago. His story was one of fear, humiliation, and lasting trauma. Jamal had been a teenager at the time, playing basketball with his friends in the park when he was approached by officers who accused him of being involved in a robbery that had happened miles away. Despite having no evidence, the officers detained him, searched him, and questioned him for hours without cause. Jamal stood before the room, his posture rigid, but his voice was steady, despite the anger and frustration that simmered beneath the surface. "I was 16 when this happened," Jamal began, his eyes scanning the room. "I was with my friends playing basketball. We weren't doing anything wrong. But that didn't matter. The officers didn't care who I was or what I was doing. They saw a young black man in a hoodie, and that was enough to make them think I was guilty." The room was quiet as Jamal's words reverberated through the space. "I remember being terrified. I remember feeling like I was being treated like a criminal simply because of where I was, because of what I looked like. They didn't ask me my name. They didn't ask me what I was doing. They just assumed the worst. Jamal took a breath, his hands trembling slightly. That night, I felt like my life didn't matter, like I was less than. And I know I'm not the only one who's felt that way. So many of us have been stopped, questioned, harassed, and treated like we don't belong here, like we're a threat, when all we're doing is living our lives. As Jamal spoke, Samuel could see the room shift once again. Officers who had previously looked down at their notes or avoided eye contact were now looking at Jamal, really looking at him. The gravity of his story had pierced through the walls that had kept them at a distance from the truth. "I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty," Jamal continued. "I'm here to ask you to understand. I'm here to ask you to see us, to see me, not just as a statistic or a suspect, but as a person. I want to believe that things can change, but for that to happen, we need to trust each other. And that starts with you." Jamal's words hung in the air, their impact undeniable. Chief Mitchell stepped forward again, his voice measured but full of conviction. "Thank you, Jamal, for sharing your story. I know how difficult it must have been, and I know it's not just about one incident. It's about the cumulative effect of all the interactions like the one you've described. And the reality is, we have to do better. We have to be better." He turned to the officers in the room. "This is why we're here today, to hear these stories, to understand how deeply these experiences affect people's lives, and to make sure that this never happens again. But I need your commitment, your willingness to make this change a reality. It's going to take all of us, officers and community members, working together. It's not going to happen overnight, but we can make it happen." There was a pause as the room absorbed Mitchell's words. Then one of the officers, a middle-aged man named Officer Daniels, stood up. His expression was one of discomfort, but also sincerity. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice rough but honest. "I've made mistakes. I've done things I'm not proud of, and I've been part of the problem. I've assumed things about people, about their intentions, because of where they come from or how they look. And for that, I'm sorry." There was a murmur from the room, and even Samuel felt a flicker of hope as Officer Daniels continued. "I'm committed to doing better. I can't change the past, but I can change how I do my job moving forward. I can start by listening, by understanding that the people I serve aren't just names or faces. They're human beings just like me." His words were met with a mixture of silence and nods of approval. It was a significant moment, a shift that wasn't about perfect solutions, but about the willingness to acknowledge and address the deep-seated issues within the department. It wasn't about sweeping things under the rug or pretending that everything was fine. It was about confronting the truth and committing to change. As the meeting continued, more officers began to speak up, some apologizing for their actions, others acknowledging the gaps in their understanding. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The dialogue had been opened, and it was clear that the officers in the room were no longer simply passive participants. They were actively engaging, questioning their roles, and committing to a different way of serving their community. The days after the first official community meeting were filled with a mix of optimism and anxiety. The Bridges to Change initiative had taken its first major step, and the officers had shown a willingness to listen, to engage in the uncomfortable conversations that were so desperately needed. But Samuel, ever the realist, knew that this was just the beginning. A single meeting, no matter how impactful, could not erase years of mistrust and deep-seated resentment. The real work lay in what came next, implementation. The conversations had been important, but now it was time for action. Chief Mitchell, who had been a vocal supporter of the initiative, had already begun pushing for tangible changes within the department. The officers, including Lacey and Daniels, had agreed to engage in a series of community outreach programs and training sessions designed to build stronger, more empathetic relationships with the people they served. Samuel had agreed to be a part of the next phase, but he was under no illusions about the challenges ahead. Reforms in the police force were never easy. There would be resistance even from within, and not all officers were as committed to the idea of change as Mitchell and his more open-minded colleagues. But Samuel had lived through worse struggles, and he knew that change wasn't a straight path. It was a series of steps, sometimes backward, but always moving forward. The first major step was a community policing program that would place officers in direct contact with local residents, not just in moments of crisis, but in everyday situations. Officers would be expected to attend community events, engage in casual conversations with residents, and build trust in neighborhoods where they had previously been seen only as enforcers. Lacey was excited about the potential of this program, having witnessed firsthand the way positive interactions could shift perceptions. She had already been participating in community outreach efforts, helping organize neighborhood cleanups and local events where officers could meet people in a relaxed setting. But even she knew that it would take more than casual conversations at picnics or charity events to change the dynamics between police and the community. As the program began, the officers received the first round of training on de-escalation, racial sensitivity, and community engagement. The training sessions were mandatory, and Chief Mitchell had made it clear that there would be no exceptions. Lacey had been involved in organizing the sessions, making sure that the training was not just theoretical, but practical, designed to challenge the officers to think critically about their roles in perpetuating systemic inequality. Samuel, too, had a part to play in these sessions. He had been asked to speak at several of the training events, sharing his personal experiences and offering insight into what it meant to be a black man in a world where the police were often seen as an occupying force. His stories, though painful, were essential. They weren't just about what had happened to him. They were about the lived experiences of entire communities that had felt alienated and ignored by the very people meant to protect them. On the day of the first community policing event, the park was filled with people, officers and residents alike. There was a sense of optimism in the air, though tempered by a realistic understanding of the challenges that lay ahead. Officers were stationed at different areas of the park, engaging in casual conversations with residents. Some people were wary, unsure whether the officers' efforts were genuine or just another attempt to placate the community. Others were more open, willing to give it a chance, willing to take a small step toward reconciliation. Samuel watched from a distance as Lacey walked up to a group of teenagers who were playing basketball. He had seen her in action before, how she could engage people without pushing too hard, how she could create a space where people felt comfortable speaking up. Today she was talking to one of the young men who had been stopped by the police just a few months ago. The conversation wasn't easy. There were uncomfortable silences and a few tense exchanges, but it was happening, and that was what mattered. Meanwhile, Chief Mitchell was standing by one of the park's large trees, speaking with a local business owner who had been vocal about the challenges his community had faced with the police in the past. Samuel saw the genuine effort on Mitchell's face as he listened, nodding in agreement and offering his thoughts on how the police could improve their relationship with small business owners. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was the beginning of a new kind of relationship. As the afternoon wore on, the event slowly began to wind down. The officers were still engaged in conversations, but the park was starting to empty out. Samuel walked over to the group of officers near the basketball courts, where Lacey was talking with a few of the young men who had been hesitant at first, but were now starting to open up. He watched them for a moment, noting how the tension had begun to ease. This was progress, he knew, but it was fragile. Lacey saw him approaching and gave him a small wave. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice light but with an undertone of exhaustion. "It's a start," Samuel replied, his eyes scanning the park. "I can see the change in people, in the way they're talking. But we both know it's not going to be enough just to talk. We have to keep showing up, keep proving that we're here for the right reasons." Lacey nodded. "I know, but today felt like the beginning of something, like maybe we're finally doing things the right way." Samuel smiled softly. "Maybe, but just remember, Lacey, it's not about today. It's about what happens tomorrow and the day after. It's about showing up every day and making sure that change is something we live, not just something we talk about." As the park emptied out and the last of the officers began to gather, Samuel stood for a moment, looking at the faces of those who had stayed behind to talk, to connect, to engage. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt like something real was beginning to take shape. It wouldn't be easy, but if they continued on this path, with this kind of commitment, perhaps it was possible. Perhaps they could rebuild the trust that had been so broken and create a future where the community and the police work together, not in opposition, but in partnership. As the event drew to a close, Samuel lingered by the park's entrance, watching the last few families trickle out, some waving goodbye, others lost in conversation. The energy in the air had changed. There was a certain lightness, a sense that something important had just happened, even if no one was yet able to fully define what that meant. The officers were still lingering in small groups, discussing what had gone well and what had been difficult. Some looked exhausted, while others appeared a bit more relaxed than when they had arrived. But even in their tiredness, there was an unmistakable sense of accountability that had started to take root in the way they interacted with one another. Chief Mitchell approached Samuel, a thoughtful look on his face. "I think it went well," he said quietly, looking out at the park. "Better than I expected, actually." Samuel nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "It's a step, Raymond. That's all it is, a step. The hardest part comes now, when we have to keep this momentum going. People are watching, and they're tired of hearing promises. They want to see action." Mitchell gave a small sigh, running his hand through his hair. "I know, and we'll have to prove that this is real. But I think today was important. People came. They engaged. They shared their stories. We heard things we don't usually hear in briefings or reports. That's what we need. Honest conversations." Samuel glanced over at the officers, still talking with the community members, nodding as if they were beginning to understand the deeper implications of the day's conversations. "I saw it too," he said. "Some of them are starting to get it, but you can't change a mindset overnight. You'll need more than today to make it stick. You'll need consistency." Mitchell met his gaze, the weight of Samuel's words clear. "That's what we're working on. This isn't just about today. We're planning more of these events, more community engagements, and a series of follow-up discussions. We need to keep this dialogue open and keep the officers involved in real, ongoing conversations with the people they serve. No more token gestures. This has to be real." "Good," Samuel said, his voice firm but warm. "Because in the end, it's about trust. And trust takes time to build, but it can be destroyed in an instant. We're all going to have to work at it every single day. No shortcuts." Just then, Lacey approached them, her expression tired but determined. "I've been talking to some of the officers who weren't sure about the community event. They're saying they felt good about the interactions today. They're actually talking about doing more outreach. Beyond these events, like hanging out at local cafes, attending neighborhood gatherings just to be seen and heard." Samuel smiled slightly, his pride in her efforts showing. "I think it's working," he said. "I think they're starting to see that it's not enough to just enforce the law. They need to be part of the community, not outside of it." Lacey gave a nod. "It's not easy, though. I can already see some of them pulling back, especially the older officers, the ones who are set in their ways. But they're willing to try, and that's more than I expected." Chief Mitchell looked between Samuel and Lacey, a thought crossing his mind. The next challenge will be getting the department to fully integrate these new practices into their daily routines. "I've been pushing for it, but there's resistance. Some officers think it's a waste of time. Others think it's too much change at once. But we can't let up. I need people like you, Samuel, to help guide them through this." Samuel's expression softened as he looked at Mitchell, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I'll do what I can, but this isn't just about the officers' understanding. The community needs to know that this is more than just a temporary fix. They need to see that this time, things will be different." "Agreed," Mitchell said, looking back at the officers. "We need both sides involved, and we need transparency in everything we do. This can't just be a one-off event or a few weeks of good intentions. This has to be a long-term commitment." Lacey, who had been listening carefully, spoke up. "I think the next step is about creating more spaces for the officers in the community to interact in a non-enforcement capacity. We need to show that we're not here just to arrest people. We need to build relationships." Samuel agreed. "Exactly. We've talked a lot about training, about understanding each other's perspectives. But what's just as important is the everyday interactions. The officers have to be visible. not just when there's a call to answer or an emergency to handle. They need to be part of the community, to build trust in small moments, not just when something goes wrong. Mitchell gave a thoughtful nod. I'll speak with the higher-ups about creating more programs like this, and we'll keep pushing for those long-term goals. It's time for us to start showing up differently. The conversation shifted as the officers began to wrap up the event. Some had already left, while others stayed to speak with residents, continuing the discussions that had begun earlier in the day. There was still work to do, but Samuel could feel that something real was beginning to take root. The hope he had carried in his heart for so long, though often dimmed by years of frustration, had grown stronger. It wasn't just about today or tomorrow. It was about a future that was finally starting to look possible. As the park emptied out and the last few community members began to head home, Samuel turned to Mitchell and Lacey. "You've taken the first steps," he said, "but this is a marathon, not a sprint. You'll have to keep pushing, even when it's hard, even when it feels like nothing's changing. The real work starts now." Mitchell stood tall, his expression resolute. "And we will. We've started something that we're not going to stop until it's complete. Together we can make sure that change sticks." Samuel smiled softly. "That's the spirit. Let's make sure we keep going." Months had passed since the first Bridges to Change event, and the ripple effects were starting to be felt across the community. It wasn't as if the divide had suddenly disappeared, or that trust had been completely rebuilt in a matter of weeks, but there was a noticeable shift, a steady progress, that had begun to take root in the lives of the residents and the officers alike. The ongoing community engagement programs had become a regular feature in the park, and each time they took place, the conversations grew more open, more honest, and more hopeful. For Samuel, it was a long-awaited moment of recognition. He had spent most of his life fighting for justice, and though the battle was far from over, he had never seen his community so ready to speak up, so willing to collaborate. The officers, too, had made noticeable efforts. Lacey, once unsure about her role, had become one of the most dedicated participants, encouraging her fellow officers to show up and be present in the community in a way that was beyond the usual duties. It was no longer just about enforcing the law. It was about participating in the community they swore to protect. Today, Morningside Park was alive with a different kind of energy. The morning had started with the usual joggers and dog walkers, but as the day went on, the park slowly filled up with families, teenagers, and elderly residents. It was the first big community event since the beginning of the Bridges to Change initiative, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation. Samuel sat on his favorite bench, sipping his coffee, watching the familiar faces as they arrived. The sun was warm, the sounds of children playing echoed in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt like things were shifting in the right direction. The event was a celebration of the progress they had made, a chance to showcase the successes of their collaborative efforts. But more importantly, it was an opportunity to continue the dialogue. Marcus had been instrumental in organizing it, gathering local organizations, schools, and businesses to show their support for the initiative. This wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about the community coming together to demonstrate their shared commitment to change. Lacey walked by, her face lighting up when she saw Samuel. "Hey, Mr. Carter," she said with a smile. "I'm glad to see you here. You're not one to miss an event like this, huh?" Samuel chuckled. "I've been to plenty of these events, but today feels different. I can see it in the faces of the people who are here. There's something in the air today. Hope, I think. It's still fragile, but it's there." Lacey nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, it's like you said before. Trust doesn't happen overnight, but we're getting there. And it's not just the officers showing up. The community's been more engaged, more willing to be part of the solution. It's been incredible to see." "Good to hear," Samuel replied. "That's what it takes. But we can't stop here. This is just one moment. The real work comes next, making sure these changes stick, making sure the community keeps feeling heard." Lacey took a seat next to him on the bench, her eyes following the groups of people gathering in the park. "I know, but today feels like a step forward. More officers are showing up for these events, and I see the conversations happening that didn't happen before. People are listening. The hard part, though, is going to be when we're no longer in the park. When the training ends and the events are over, we have to make sure we're still there for the community when it's not a special event. Samuel nodded, his expression serious. That's the challenge, making sure we're there for the right reasons. This can't just be about PR or ticking boxes. We need to be present in everyday life, in the community, in a way that's meaningful. We need to show people that we're here to listen, not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard. Lacey sighed, but there was a resolve in her voice. I'm committed to that. I know some of my colleagues aren't there yet, but I'm not giving up. And I know you won't either. Samuel smiled, his eyes thoughtful. We'll all keep pushing. It's what we do. But we can't do it alone. We need the community's help too. They've got to be willing to trust us, and we need to prove that we're worthy of that trust. Just as they were talking, Marcus appeared, walking toward them with a purposeful stride. His usual confidence was evident in the way he held himself, but there was something else in his expression today, an unspoken sense of pride in what they had accomplished so far. Good to see you both, Marcus greeted, his tone warm but with an edge of excitement. It's starting to come together, isn't it? It is, Lacey said with a smile. I think we've finally turned a corner. People are starting to trust that this isn't just another attempt at change. They see that we're in it for the long haul. Marcus nodded, taking a seat next to Samuel. It's been incredible to watch, but we're not done. We've made progress, but the real work starts now. We have to keep this momentum going. There are still people who are skeptical, and we can't let up. We need to keep proving ourselves every day, in every interaction. Samuel leaned back, his hands resting on his cane. We've always known that, Marcus. The key is making sure that we're not just talking about change, we're living it. We need to show the community that we're committed, not just in big gestures, but in the small, everyday moments. Marcus looked around the park, his gaze sweeping over the gathering crowd. That's exactly it. We're seeing the change now, but the real test is going to be when the attention dies down, when the cameras are gone and the spotlight fades. Can we keep this up then? That's the question. Samuel stood slowly, his back creaking slightly as he stretched. We'll keep pushing, Marcus. As long as there's work to be done, we'll keep showing up. As the afternoon wore on, the park became more filled with energy, the sounds of laughter, music, and conversations blending together. The community had come together in ways that Samuel had only dreamed of in his younger years. There was a sense of unity, of something finally beginning to click into place, even though the work was far from over. The event was a symbol of progress, but Samuel knew that they couldn't let the moment become a static memory. They had to keep pushing forward, no matter how difficult or slow the progress would be. At the center of the event, a local group of teenagers performed a play about their experiences with law enforcement, highlighting the pain of being treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods. The performance wasn't just a story, it was a mirror to the realities many had lived. It was a reminder of why this initiative was necessary, why the conversation had to continue, and why those who held power had to learn to listen, truly listen, to those they were sworn to protect. Lacey, standing at the edge of the crowd, watched with a sense of pride. It had been a long road from the early days of discomfort and resistance. She had seen her colleagues grow, many of them starting to understand the gravity of their positions, the impact their actions had on the community. Some of the officers had even begun seeking her out for advice, asking how to better engage with residents, how to de-escalate situations before they spiraled. It was a shift, one that had taken patience, but one that she knew was beginning to stick. Lacey, are you seeing this? Marcus asked as he joined her. His voice was a mix of pride and excitement. This is what we've been working for. The community is finally starting to feel like they belong again, like they have a voice. And the officers? They're starting to see that it's not just about authority, but about being part of something bigger. Lacey smiled, her eyes reflecting the same pride. I know. It's been tough, but it's starting to feel like the pieces are falling into place. They're really starting to listen. Some of the officers who were most resistant to change are actually talking to residents now. I never thought I'd see the day. They watched as Chief Mitchell walked through the park, talking with residents, engaging in casual conversation with families and local business owners. He was no longer just the figurehead at the front of meetings. He had become an active part of the community, demonstrating the change they wanted to see within the force. Lacey had seen Mitchell evolve as a leader, embracing the uncomfortable conversations and the long-term work that was needed to repair the damage done over generations. As Mitchell approached them, he gave a small wave and smiled. "You two have done a remarkable job today. The turnout is better than I expected, and the energy here is incredible. But you both know as well as I do, we can't stop here." Lacey nodded, her expression focused. "I've been talking to a few of the officers about continuing these engagements, even outside of these events. It's not just about coming together during these events. We need to be present in everyday life, in the neighborhoods, in the cafes, at community centers. Officers need to be visible, not just when something goes wrong, but when things are going right too." Mitchell smiled, clearly pleased with the progress. "Exactly. It's about rebuilding the trust that's been lost. And it's going to take more than just appearances at events. It's going to take consistency. But today, I'm seeing a shift. We've had a long road to this point, but the momentum is finally there. We just need to keep pushing." Samuel joined the group, having spent some time talking with a few older residents who were still wary of the police. Despite the progress made, he had seen the weariness in their eyes, the years of frustration and pain that weren't so easily undone by one event or one conversation. But even they couldn't deny that something was different this time. There was a genuine attempt at change, and though it was fragile, it was enough to bring a glimmer of hope. "I've been talking to the community too," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful. "There's progress, but there's still hesitation. They want to believe in what we're doing, but they've seen so many things fail before. They need to see this last, Raymond. This can't just be another false promise." Mitchell's expression became more serious as he listened. "I understand. We've made mistakes in the past, and I'm not going to pretend it'll be easy. But I'm committed to seeing this through. I think we're at the tipping point. The community is willing to give us a chance, but we can't let them down." "We can't afford to," Samuel agreed. "There's too much at stake, but if we keep showing up, day after day, if we prove that we're here for the long haul, I think we can make this stick." The afternoon passed slowly as more and more people engaged with the officers, talking openly about their concerns and experiences. For the first time, there was a sense of real dialogue, real exchange happening between those who had been on opposite sides for so long. As the sun began to set, the park began to empty out, the crowd slowly dissipating. But there was no mistaking the shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. The work was far from finished, but it felt as though they had finally begun to lay a foundation that could sustain the weight of real change. As the last of the officers packed up and left the park, Samuel, Mitchell, and Lacey stood together for a moment, the evening light casting long shadows over the ground. There was a quiet understanding between them. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with setbacks and challenges. But for the first time, they all felt like they were on the same path. One that, if walked together, could lead to a future where both police and community could finally trust each other again. 5 years had passed since the first Bridges to Change event in Morningside Park. The park was no longer just a place where people came to relax or play. It had become a symbol of something much bigger, something that had started with a single conversation and had grown into a movement. Samuel sat once again on his favorite bench, the familiar feel of the worn wood under his hands, grounding him as he watched the park come alive with activity. The vibrant trees, the children running freely, the groups of people enjoying the afternoon, all of it seemed to echo the progress that had been made. The shift wasn't complete, but it was real, and it was lasting. Samuel reflected on the journey that had led them to this point. The community engagement efforts, the push for police reform, the tireless work of people like Chief Raymond Mitchell, Officer Lacey, and Marcus Harris. They had all come together to create something transformative. It had been difficult, painful at times, but it had also been beautiful to witness the gradual blossoming of trust, understanding, and collaboration. The once stiff relationships between the community and the police had thawed, bit by bit. No one pretended that everything had been solved. There were still challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of failure. But there was a shared belief now that things could be different. There was the understanding that the fight for justice wasn't a battle fought in isolation, but a collective effort. Today was a special day. The park hosted a large community celebration, marking the anniversary of the Bridges to Change initiative. There were speeches from city leaders, performances from local artists, and dozens of booths representing different organizations that had partnered with the police over the years. What had once been a divisive relationship between the police and the community had transformed into a partnership built on shared goals. Chief Mitchell walked past Samuel, pausing for a moment to greet him. "It's good to see you here, Samuel," he said with a smile, his usual calm demeanor reflecting a quiet pride in the progress made. "I never imagined we'd be here when we first started." Samuel looked up at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I'm glad we're here." Mitchell paused for a moment, looking out at the people gathered in the park. "I remember the first meeting, the skepticism, the distrust in the air. We've come a long way, but it hasn't been easy. It's taken work, real work, from both sides." Samuel nodded. "And it's not over yet. This isn't a finish line. It's just a checkpoint. The work has to keep going, even when it gets tough." Mitchell's eyes darkened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "You're right. We've made progress, but the real test will be whether we can sustain it. We need to make sure that this doesn't fade into the background, that the next generation of officers understands what we're building." "Exactly," Samuel said. "It's the young ones who will carry this forward, the ones who are growing up seeing the change, the ones who have been part of this process from the start." Lacey, who had joined the conversation, spoke up, her voice full of conviction. "I've been talking to some of the newer recruits. They get it. They see the importance of community policing, of showing up in the neighborhoods, not just as officers, but as neighbors. It's been encouraging to see how quickly they've embraced it." Mitchell nodded. "That's the future then. If we can keep this momentum going, if we can integrate these principles into the fabric of the department, then maybe we'll get to the point where this kind of change is just normal, where community and police work together without the barriers we've spent so many years fighting." Samuel smiled softly, the weight of the moment settling in. "It's not just about the police, though. It's the community, too. We've all had to change. We've had to open up, to listen more, to trust more. And that trust is fragile, but I do believe we're getting there." Just then, Marcus Harris arrived, stepping into the circle with his usual energy and enthusiasm. "Well, if it isn't the three people who started all this," he said with a grin, looking at Mitchell, Lacey, and Samuel. "It's been a wild ride, hasn't it?" "It has," Lacey said, smiling back at him. "But look at where we are now. This event, the turnout, it's amazing." Marcus's gaze swept over the park, taking in the sea of people, the families gathered, the police officers mingling with the community members. He looked back at Samuel, his expression more reflective than usual. "You know, when we first started this, I wasn't sure it would work. I knew we needed something different, but I didn't know if the city would be ready for it. But look at this. Look at all these people who believe in what we're trying to do." Samuel's eyes softened as he looked around the park. "They believe in it because they can see it working, because we've shown up day after day and we haven't backed down. The real victory is in the everyday actions, when an officer shows up to a community event, when a resident sees that the police aren't just a presence but a part of their lives. It's not perfect," Mitchell added, his voice serious but hopeful. "But it's a start, and if we keep showing up, we'll keep proving that this isn't just about the police or the community. It's about all of us together." The conversation paused for a moment as the community event began to officially open. The crowd began to disperse, heading toward different activities, booths, and performances. But the undercurrent of solidarity, of shared responsibility for the future, was palpable. As people interacted, whether they were police officers or community members, it was clear that something had shifted. They were no longer divided by distrust or fear. They were connected by a common goal. Samuel watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with quiet pride. The work was far from over, but today he could see the fruit of their labor. This wasn't just a victory for one community or one group. It was a victory for everyone who had fought for justice, for understanding, and for a better future. The next generation of officers, of community leaders, would carry this torch forward. The story wasn't over yet, but it was beginning to take shape in a way that Samuel had never imagined. As the event unfolded, the park seemed to pulse with life, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the low hum of conversation. The celebration wasn't just about the officers and community members who had gathered. It was a testament to the changes that had taken place over the years. Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched people interact. Community leaders, police officers, and residents, all coming together in a way that had seemed impossible just a few years ago. In the distance, he saw Jamal talking to a group of young men, laughing and joking in a way that seemed effortless. Samuel knew that Jamal had been one of the most skeptical when the Bridges to Change initiative began. He had been the victim of police profiling years ago, and the scars of that experience ran deep. But today, Jamal wasn't just participating in the event. He was a part of the transformation, helping to shape the conversation and lead the way for the next generation. As Samuel took in the sight of the park, he was joined by Rachel Foster, who had been at the forefront of the fight for justice. She had seen the impact of police brutality firsthand and had been a tireless advocate for change. She was speaking to a small group of officers, exchanging ideas and laughing along with them. Samuel couldn't help but smile. The day was not just about police and the community working together. It was about dismantling the barriers that had long kept them apart and building something stronger in their place. "I never thought I'd see the day," Rachel said, approaching Samuel with a smile. "Look at all of this. Look at the officers engaging with the community like this. It feels like we've finally turned a corner." Samuel nodded, his gaze still sweeping the park. "It's been a long road, but I think this time we've made something that will stick. It won't be perfect, but it's a start, and sometimes that's all we need." Rachel smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "I hope you're right, but we both know that real change is fragile. We've seen these kinds of moments before, haven't we? The question is, can we keep it going? Can we sustain it?" Samuel turned to look at her, his expression serious. "The answer to that is in the next generation. The officers who are here today, like Lacey and the others, are the ones who will carry this forward. They've seen the change, and they're committed to it. But it's not just on them. It's on all of us. The community needs to keep showing up. We need to hold each other accountable." Rachel nodded. "That's the real challenge. Making sure it doesn't fade when the cameras are gone, when the media attention dies down. It's up to the officers and the community to keep this going, to show that it's more than just words." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Chief Mitchell stepped up to Samuel and Rachel. His face was tired but satisfied, and there was a subtle pride in his eyes as he looked out at the gathering crowd. "You both did a good job today," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the responsibility that still lay ahead. "But we all know that this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." "I know," Samuel said, his gaze shifting back to the park. "But it feels different today. People are listening, the officers are listening, and the community is starting to feel like they belong. That's what this is all about, building trust, one conversation at a time." Mitchell's eyes softened as he looked at Samuel. "It's more than just trust. It's about respect. It's about showing that we see each other for who we are, not just for the roles we play. And that's what I'm seeing today. Officers are engaging with people as equals, not as suspects or problems. It's a shift in how we operate, in how we understand our responsibility to the community." Samuel smiled, his eyes reflecting the quiet hope he had carried for so long. "I think you're getting it, Raymond. You've made a lot of progress. But the real work is going to be when the new recruits start to see this as the standard. When this becomes how they think about their role, not just the exception." Rachel glanced between the two men, her eyes thoughtful. "And that's where we come in. We have to keep pushing. We can't let this become just a nice story, a feel-good moment. We need to make sure this is institutionalized, that it becomes the norm, not just a campaign." Chief Mitchell nodded, his expression resolute. "That's the goal, to make this a permanent part of the way we serve our city. We'll keep pushing for reform, for accountability, and for training that continues to evolve. But we need the community's help. We can't do this alone. Samuel's voice was steady as he looked at Mitchell. And that's why we're all here today. We're not here to be perfect. We're here to make sure we show up every single day. We're here to keep having these hard conversations, to keep pushing for better. The crowd in the park continued to swell, and as the evening light bathed the gathering in a soft, golden hue, Samuel allowed himself a moment to reflect. He had fought for this for so long, had endured the pain of a community that had been ignored, disrespected, and mistreated by the very people sworn to protect them. But today, for the first time, he could see the seeds of something real taking root. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was a new chapter. The road ahead was long, and there would be setbacks. But today, as he looked around at the faces of the officers and community members who were working side by side, Samuel knew that the story they were writing together was one of hope, change, and redemption.